The wind carried the scent of jet fuel and rain through the open hangar doors of Ashford Aerospace Technologies, a smell that Nathan Cross had learned to ignore the same way he'd learned to ignore the ache in his lower back that never quite disappeared no matter how many ibuprofen tablets he swallowed with his morning coffee. The testing facility sprawled across 43 acres of industrial Seattle waterfront, a monument to American engineering excellence built by a man who'd believed that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to reach for it. That man was dead now, 8 months buried beneath polished granite in a cemetery where the tombstones cost more than Nathan earned in 6 months of pushing a mop across floors so clean they reflected the overhead lights like still water. Nathan knelt on the concrete beside the Talon 9 prototype scrubbing at an oil stain that had been there since Tuesday when one of the hydraulic technicians had dropped a wrench and punctured a pressure line. The stain had already set into the porous surface, which meant he'd be here for another 20 minutes, working the industrial degreaser into the concrete with circular motions that made his right shoulder burn. His hands were raw from the chemicals despite the heavy-duty gloves, and the knee pads he wore did nothing to cushion the constant pressure against bone that had been stressed by too many ejections from too many aircraft that had been dying beneath him. Above his head, the steel catwalk rang with the sharp percussion of expensive heels crossing from the administrative wing toward the observation deck where the executives gathered to watch demonstrations that would determine whether billion-dollar contracts went to Ashford Aerospace or to one of their competitors who were always circling like sharks who'd scented blood in the water. Nathan didn't need to look up to know who was approaching because Victoria Ashford's footsteps had a particular rhythm that he'd learned to recognize over the past 6 months, a cadence that spoke of someone who moved through the world expecting it to get out of her way. She was 32 years old and had inherited this company when her father's heart had stopped beating in the middle of a presentation to the board of directors, and she'd spent every day since trying to prove that she was more than just the daughter of a great man. The board members who flanked her now were all men over 50 who wore suits that cost more than Nathan's monthly rent and who smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated whether Victoria was strong enough to keep them rich or whether she'd collapse under pressure and they'd need to find someone else to sign their paychecks. The group stopped at the railing directly above where Nathan worked, and he kept his head down and his movements steady because the first rule of survival when you'd fallen as far as he had was to make yourself invisible to people who had the power to make your life even harder than it already was. But invisibility required stillness, and the oil stain wasn't going to remove itself, so he kept scrubbing while the conversation above him filtered down through the industrial acoustics of the hangar. Victoria's voice carried the kind of crisp authority that came from expensive education and the belief that the world would listen if you spoke with sufficient confidence. The presentation she was delivering to the board members touched on quarterly projections and fuel efficiency ratios and the competitive advantages that Ashford Aerospace maintained over Boeing and Lockheed Martin in the specialized niche of experimental military propulsion systems. Nathan had heard variations of this speech a dozen times during late-night cleaning shifts when Victoria thought she was alone in her office, rehearsing her lines to an audience of empty chairs and her own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Puget Sound. One of the board members interrupted her mid-sentence to ask a question about the Talon 9's performance specifications, and Victoria's response was immediate and technically precise in a way that reminded Nathan of the aerospace engineering professors he'd studied under at the University of Washington, back when his life had been pointed toward a future that didn't involve industrial cleaning supplies and chronic pain that woke him up at 3 in the morning. Then Victoria made a mistake. She glanced down at Nathan, just a flicker of her eyes toward the man kneeling on the concrete below her, and something in that glance triggered a response that Nathan had seen before in people who were performing for an audience and needed to establish dominance through the humiliation of someone who couldn't fight back. Her voice shifted registers, dropping the technical precision and adopting a tone that was designed to carry to everyone in the hangar. Careful there. Don't let your hands touch something you're not qualified to understand. Jets aren't for people who only know how to mop floors. Laughter erupted from the board members around her, and the sound echoed through the hangar with the particular quality of men who were relieved to have someone else become the target of mockery so they didn't have to worry about becoming targets themselves. Nathan kept scrubbing the oil stain, his movements unchanging, but his eyes lifted toward the Talon 9 prototype mounted behind safety glass 30 feet away. The aircraft was beautiful in the way that perfectly engineered machines were beautiful, all clean lines and mathematical precision. And for a moment, Nathan let himself remember what it felt like to sit in a cockpit at 30,000 feet, with nothing between him and the stratosphere except a canopy of reinforced glass and the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The memory lasted 3 seconds before he pushed it down into the same place where he kept all the other memories that didn't serve any purpose except to remind him of everything he'd lost. He returned his attention to the oil stain and the burning in his shoulder and the knowledge that he had 4 more hours of shift remaining before he could go home to the apartment where his daughter was waiting for him to help her with homework that she probably didn't need help with because she was smarter than he'd been at her age. In the corner of the hangar, partially hidden behind a stack of equipment crates that were waiting to be cataloged and stored, Lily Cross sat with her back against the concrete wall and her notebook open on her lap. She was 8 years old with dark hair that she refused to let Nathan cut, even though it fell past her shoulders and was always getting tangled, and she had her mother's eyes, which meant that looking at her sometimes hurt in a way that had nothing to do with spinal fractures or torn ligaments. The notebook was filled with drawings of aircraft, not the crude stick figure sketches that most 8-year-olds produced, but detailed technical schematics that showed fuel lines and hydraulic systems and the precise angles of control surfaces that determined whether a plane would fly or fall. She'd been drawing these pictures since she was 5, back when Nathan had still been trying to convince himself that working as a janitor at an aerospace company was somehow noble, because it meant his daughter could grow up breathing the same air as the machines that touched the sky. Lily had heard her father get insulted by the woman in the expensive suit, and her small hands had clenched around the pencil hard enough to snap the graphite point. She didn't understand why adults were so cruel to each other, why they measured worth by job titles and bank accounts instead of by whether someone was kind or whether they kept their promises or whether they stayed awake at night worrying about the people they loved. Her father had taught her that worth came from character, but the world seemed determined to teach her something different. The board members in Victoria moved away from the railing, their footsteps receding toward the observation deck, where comfortable chairs and climate control waited to insulate them from the industrial reality of the hangar floor. Nathan finished with the oil stain and stood slowly feeling his spine compress and then reluctantly extend as he straightened to his full height. He was 35 years old but felt 20 years older when he moved, and there were mornings when getting out of bed required a negotiation between his will and his body's insistence that remaining horizontal was the only reasonable choice. He collected his cleaning supplies and loaded them onto the cart that he pushed from section to section of the facility, a rolling inventory of mops and buckets and bottles filled with chemicals that promised to remove any stain if you were willing to scrub hard enough and long enough. The cart's wheels squeaked because the left front bearing was worn, and Nathan had mentioned it to his supervisor 3 times. But replacement parts apparently weren't in the budget for equipment that was used by people whose opinions about squeaking wheels didn't matter. Lily appeared at his elbow, her notebook clutched against her chest and her expression carefully neutral in the way that children learn to hide their emotions when showing them would make things harder for the adults they loved. She didn't say anything about what she'd heard, and Nathan didn't acknowledge it because there was nothing to say that would make it better. This was the world they lived in, where people with power used it to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel smaller, and the only defense was to refuse to give them the satisfaction of seeing the wound. They walked together toward the service elevator that would take them down to the basement level, where Nathan's locker was located and where they could retrieve their coats before heading home through the Seattle rain that had been falling steadily since noon. The elevator was old and slow and smelled like industrial lubricant, and the fluorescent lights inside flickered in a way that suggested the ballast was failing. Nathan made a mental note to mention it to maintenance, even though he knew from experience that problems in the service areas took months to address because the company's resources were allocated toward things that visitors and clients would see. The ride down took 40 seconds, and neither of them spoke because they'd learned that sometimes silence was easier than trying to find words that could carry the weight of everything they weren't saying. When the elevator doors opened, Nathan guided Lily toward his locker while he thought about the fact that he had 3 more hours remaining in his shift and that Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door was probably wondering when they'd be home because she had her own grandchildren to worry about and couldn't babysit indefinitely, even though she never complained and never asked for payment beyond the occasional casserole that Nathan cooked when he had energy left over from working. The locker room was empty because the day shift maintenance crew had already gone home and the night shift wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. Nathan opened his locker and retrieved Lily's backpack, which was heavy with textbooks that seemed excessive for an 8-year-old, but which the school insisted were necessary for proper academic development. He also grabbed his own jacket, a weatherproof shell that had been issued to him when he'd first started working at Ashford Aerospace, and which had the company logo embroidered on the breast pocket like a brand marking him as property. Before they could leave, Nathan's radio crackled to life, with the dispatcher's voice requesting that he report to the executive floor because someone had spilled coffee in the hallway and it needed to be cleaned immediately before it could stain the imported Italian marble that had been installed when the administrative wing was renovated 3 years ago at a cost that could have paid Nathan's salary for a decade. He acknowledged the request and told Lily that she'd need to wait in the break room while he took care of the spill, and she nodded without complaint because she'd learned that complaining didn't change anything. The break room on the executive floor was designed for administrative assistants and junior executives with comfortable chairs and a coffee machine that produced espresso instead of the burnt sludge that came from the machine in the basement. Lily settled into a chair near the window and opened her notebook to continue working on her latest drawing, which showed a modified version of the Talon 9 with enhanced fuel efficiency through a redesigned combustion chamber configuration that she'd extrapolated from listening to engineers discuss the prototype's limitations. Nathan left her there and walked down the hallway toward the coffee spill, which turned out to be significant enough that it had soaked into the grout between marble tiles and would require specialized cleaning solution to remove without damaging the stone's finish. He retrieved the necessary supplies from his cart and began the careful process of treating the stain, working on his hands and knees while executives stepped around him without acknowledgement because he was part of the building's infrastructure rather than a person who merited recognition. 30 minutes passed before the marble was clean enough to satisfy his professional standards, and when he returned to the break room to collect Lily, he found that she'd been joined by Walter Hayes, the chief engineer, who'd worked at Ashford Aerospace for longer than Nathan had been alive. Walter was 65 years old with white hair and a pronounced limp from a helicopter crash in Vietnam that had shattered his left femur in 17 places, and he had the kind of calm competence that came from having survived situations where competence was the difference between living and dying. Walter was looking at Lily's notebook, his reading glasses perched on his nose, and his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he was seeing something that surprised him. Nathan paused in the doorway, uncertain whether he should interrupt, but Walter glanced up and gestured him over with a slight movement of his hand. The drawing Lily had been working on showed the Talon 9's fuel system with annotations in her careful handwriting that explained how moving the secondary fuel pump 6 inches forward would reduce pressure fluctuations during high-G maneuvers. The analysis was sophisticated enough that Nathan recognized it as something that would normally come from someone with an advanced degree in aerospace engineering, rather than from an 8-year-old with a mechanical pencil and too much time spent listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to understand. Walter's eyes moved from the notebook to Nathan's face, and there was a question there that Nathan couldn't answer without revealing things he'd spent 6 months keeping hidden. Instead, he reached for the notebook and closed it gently, his hand resting on the cover for a moment before he picked it up and handed it back to Lily. "Time to go, kiddo. Mrs. Chen is probably wondering where we are." Lily took the notebook and slid it into her backpack, then stood and offered Walter a small smile that was more polite than warm because she'd learned to be cautious around adults she didn't know well. Walter returned the smile and told her that she had a gift for seeing patterns that other people missed, and that if she kept practicing, she might grow up to design aircraft that would change the world. The compliment made Lily's cheeks flush with pleasure, and Nathan felt something twist in his chest, because his daughter deserved to hear praise from people who understood what she was capable of achieving. They left the executive floor and made their way out of the building into the rain that was falling hard enough now to require running to Nathan's truck, which was parked in the section of the lot designated for maintenance and custodial staff. The truck was 15 years old with rust around the wheel wells and a passenger door that required slamming twice before the latch would catch. But the engine was reliable and the heat worked, and Nathan had learned a long time ago that reliable transportation mattered more than aesthetics when you were living paycheck to paycheck. The drive home took 25 minutes through Seattle traffic that was heavy with commuters heading north toward the suburbs. Lily sat in the passenger seat with her backpack on her lap and her eyes tracking the raindrops as they raced across the window glass, and Nathan drove with the kind of automatic competence that came from having made this journey hundreds of times. The radio was tuned to a classical music station because Lily liked the way symphonies built toward crescendos and then resolved into harmony, and Nathan liked that she was developing an appreciation for things that were beautiful without being loud. They lived in Beacon Hill in a second-floor apartment that cost $1,100 a month and had thin walls that transmitted every sound from the neighbors, who fought frequently enough that Nathan had considered calling the police but hadn't, because getting involved in other people's problems was a luxury he couldn't afford. The building was old and the elevator hadn't worked in 3 years, which meant climbing stairs that made his back scream by the time he reached the second-floor landing. Mrs. Chen opened her door as soon as she heard their footsteps, her face creased with the kind of worry that grandmothers carried when children were late coming home. She was 73 years old and had immigrated from Taiwan 40 years ago, with her husband who died of a stroke before Nathan had moved into the building. Her apartment smelled like the tea she kept brewing throughout the day, and the incense she burned at a small shrine where photographs of her dead husband watched over the living room. Nathan apologized for being late and explained about the coffee spill, and Mrs. Chen waved away his apology with the same gesture she always used when he tried to thank her for watching Lily. She asked if they had eaten dinner, and when Nathan admitted they hadn't, she disappeared into her kitchen and emerged 3 minutes later with a container of leftover stir-fry that she insisted they take because she'd made too much and couldn't possibly eat it all herself, even though Nathan knew she was lying, because she did this at least twice a week. Inside their own apartment, Nathan heated the stir-fry, while Lily changed out of her school clothes and into the comfortable sweatpants she preferred for homework time. The apartment was small enough that he could see into her bedroom from the kitchen, and he watched her hang her school uniform in the closet with the same careful precision she applied to everything else in her life. She was a tidy child, almost compulsively so, and Nathan suspected it was because disorder made her anxious in ways she couldn't articulate. They ate dinner at the small table that served as their dining area, in Lily's homework station, in Nathan's workspace for the bills that he paid online because stamps cost money, and every dollar mattered when you were trying to save for things like winter coats and dental checkups and the field trip to the Museum of Flight that Lily's teacher had announced would cost $45 per student. While they ate, Lily told him about her day at school with the kind of detail that suggested she'd been storing up stories to share, and Nathan listened with the attention he'd learned to give her because these conversations were the best part of his day. After dinner, Lily settled at the table with her homework while Nathan cleaned the kitchen and then sat beside her to help with math problems that she probably could have solved faster without his assistance. But she seemed to like having him there, and he liked the quiet companionship of working together on something that had clear answers and predictable outcomes. The math gave way to reading, and Nathan listened as Lily worked through a chapter about a girl who discovered she could talk to animals, her voice confident as she navigated vocabulary words that would have challenged many adults. At 8:30, Nathan told her it was time for bed, and she complied without argument because she'd learned that fighting about bedtime only made things harder for both of them. He tucked her in and sat on the edge of her bed while she asked him to tell her a story about flying, which was a ritual they'd maintained since she was old enough to understand that her father had once done something other than clean floors. He told her about a training flight over the Cascade Mountains when he'd flown low through a valley and startled a herd of elk that had scattered like water drops when rain hit pavement. He told her about the way clouds looked from above when the sun hit them at the right angle and turned them into landscapes made of light. He told her about the silence that existed at 30,000 feet when you turned off the radio and the only sound was your own breathing inside the helmet. When he finished, Lily's eyes were heavy with sleep, and she asked the question she asked every night in different variations but with the same essential meaning. Why did you stop flying? Dad Nathan's throat tightened the way it always did when this question emerged, and he gave her the answer he always gave, because it was true even if it wasn't complete. Sometimes you have to land so someone else can take off, kiddo. Sometimes being on the ground is more important than being in the sky. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything, then nodded and closed her eyes. Nathan sat with her until her breathing slowed and deepened into sleep, and then he stood carefully to avoid making the floorboards creak. He left her door open a crack so light from the hallway would reach her if she woke up disoriented, and then he walked to his own bedroom at the end of the hall. The bedroom was barely large enough for the double bed and the dresser that held his clothes, and the window looked out onto the alley where the dumpsters were kept and where the neighbor's cat spent most nights hunting rats. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed and rolled up the right sleeve of his shirt, exposing the tattoo that covered his forearm from wrist to elbow. The design was intricate, a pair of steel wings that curved upward as if caught in the moment of flight. And beneath the wings was an inscription in Latin that most people wouldn't recognize unless they'd served in very specific units of the United States Air Force. Per aspera ad astra, through hardships to the stars. The tattoo was 15 years old now, the ink slightly faded but still clear enough that anyone with military experience would recognize it as the insignia of Greyhawk Squadron, a unit that had officially been disbanded after a training accident in Nevada had resulted in the loss of multiple aircraft and the presumed deaths of everyone involved. The official story was that mechanical failures during a sandstorm had caused 3 F-16s to crash into the desert, and that the wreckage had been so thoroughly destroyed by impact and subsequent fire that recovering bodies had been impossible. The official story was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that served a purpose, which was to hide the truth about operations that couldn't be acknowledged for them, because acknowledging them would create diplomatic problems with countries that were officially allies, but were unofficially engaged in activities that required the kind of response that Greyhawk Squadron had been designed to deliver. Nathan stared at the tattoo and thought about the men whose names were engraved on a memorial wall at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, a wall he'd never visited because seeing those names carved into stone would make their deaths feel more permanent than they already did. Corporal James Whitmore had been 22 years old and engaged to a girl from Oklahoma who'd sent him letters that smelled like lavender. Lance Corporal Andre Santos had been 19 and had talked constantly about the restaurant his family owned in San Diego and how he was going to take over the business when his service was complete. PFC Danny Chen had been 18 and had lied about his age to enlist because he'd wanted to escape a father who drank too much and a mother who'd given up trying to protect her children from the consequences. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez had been 26 and had a daughter the same age that Lily was now, and Nathan had promised him during those last moments, when they'd both known that rescue wasn't going to arrive in time, that he'd make sure Mike's daughter knew that her father had died doing something that mattered. But Nathan had never followed through on that promise because following through would have required revealing things that were classified at levels that made revelation impossible. And so Mike's daughter had grown up thinking her father had died in a training accident, rather than knowing that he died protecting people who would never know his name. Nathan pulled his sleeve down and stood his back, protesting the movement with the familiar grinding sensation that meant his L3 and L4 vertebrae were rubbing against each other in ways that bones weren't designed to tolerate. He walked to the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet where he kept the ibuprofen and the prescription muscle relaxers that a VA doctor had given him 3 years ago, with instructions to take one at bedtime as needed for pain management. The prescription bottle was nearly empty because refills required appointments that Nathan couldn't afford to take time off work to attend, and the VA clinic was across town in a neighborhood that required 2 bus transfers to reach. He took 2 ibuprofen instead of the muscle relaxer because he needed to be alert enough to wake up if Lily called for him during the night, and then he returned to his bedroom and lay down on top of the covers because undressing required energy he didn't have. Sleep came slowly and brought with it dreams that were fragments of memories rearranged into sequences that didn't make narrative sense, but which carried emotional weight that woke him multiple times before dawn. He dreamed about Claire, about the way her hair had smelled like jasmine, and the way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes even when they weren't funny. He dreamed about the hospital room where she died, and about the way her hand had felt in his when she'd made him promise to let Lily fly to give their daughter the sky that Claire wouldn't live to see. He dreamed about the Nevada desert and about Lieutenant Derek Stone's voice crackling over the radio with the kind of forced calm that people used when they knew they were about to die. He dreamed about the impact of ejecting from an aircraft that was already too low for safe ejection, about the violence of wind and gravity, and the cliff face that had stopped his descent by shattering his spine. When his alarm went off at 5:30, Nathan woke feeling like he hadn't slept at all, which was probably accurate because the dreams had been vivid enough that his brain hadn't gotten the rest it needed. He showered and dressed in the uniform that Ashford Aerospace provided to custodial staff, a dark blue jumpsuit with his name embroidered on the breast pocket and the company logo on the back. The jumpsuit was designed for utility rather than appearance, with multiple pockets for carrying cleaning supplies and reinforced knees that were supposed to protect against wear, but which never quite prevented the fabric from eventually thinning and tearing. Lily was already awake when he emerged from his bedroom, sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal and her notebook open beside her breakfast. She was working on a new drawing, this one showing what appeared to be a theoretical modification to the Talon 9's thrust vectoring system. Nathan didn't ask where she'd learned about thrust vectoring, because the answer was that she learned things from listening to conversations between engineers and from reading technical manuals that were probably supposed to be confidential, but which were left lying around in break rooms and on desks where curious 8-year-olds could find them. He made coffee in the ancient percolator that had belonged to Claire, and which produced coffee that was stronger than it needed to be, but which had the advantage of being cheap enough that he didn't feel guilty about drinking 3 cups before leaving for work. The coffee was terrible but effective, and by the time he'd finished the 3rd cup, his brain had achieved something approximating functional awareness. Miss Chen knocked on the door at 6:15, which was earlier than usual, but which she explained was necessary because she had a doctor's appointment at 8 and needed to leave by 7:30 to catch the bus that would get her to the clinic on time. Nathan thanked her and assured her that he'd be able to drop Lily at school before his shift started, and Mrs. Chen looked relieved because she'd clearly been worried about asking for this accommodation. After Mrs. Chen left, Nathan helped Lily pack her backpack and made sure she had her lunch money and her homework and the permission slip for the Museum of Flight trip that required his signature and $45 that he'd have to figure out how to budget from his next paycheck. They left the apartment at 6:45 and climbed into the truck, which started on the 2nd attempt and settled into the rough idle that meant the spark plugs probably needed replacing soon. The drive to Lily's school took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that were still mostly asleep, and Nathan watched his daughter from the corner of his eye as she stared out the window at the city waking up around them. She was quiet this morning, more withdrawn than usual, and he wondered if yesterday's incident at the aerospace facility was bothering her more than she'd admitted. When they reached the school, Nathan walked her to the entrance because she was still young enough that drop-off required parental supervision according to the district's safety policies. Before she went inside, she turned and hugged him with the fierce intensity that children used when they were trying to communicate things they didn't have words for, and Nathan hugged her back and told her that he loved her and that he'd see her after school when Mrs. Chen brought her to the facility. The drive from the school to Ashford Aerospace took another 20 minutes, and Nathan used the time to prepare himself mentally for 8 hours of work that would involve mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms and emptying trash cans filled with the detritus of people whose daily routines included things like catered lunches and afternoon lattes from the espresso machine in the executive break room. He'd learned not to resent the disparity between his life and theirs, because resentment was exhausting and didn't change anything. But some mornings, it was harder than others to maintain the emotional distance that made the work bearable. He parked in the section of the lot designated for maintenance staff and walked through the light rain that had started falling just as he'd pulled into the space. The employee entrance required scanning his badge, which was printed with a photo from his first day of work that showed him trying to smile even though he had felt like the act of taking this job was an admission of failure that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to rationalize. The custodial supervisor's office was located in the basement near the supply closets, and Nathan checked in to receive his assignment for the day. The supervisor was a man named Carl Morrison, who'd worked in building maintenance for 30 years, and who treated his staff with the kind of brusque fairness that suggested he remembered what it was like to be at the bottom of an organizational hierarchy. Carl handed Nathan a clipboard with the day's tasks written in careful printing, and Nathan scanned the list while Carl explained that there was a tour scheduled for 3 p.m. and that the executive floor needed to be spotless because the visitors were potential investors who were considering putting money into the Talon 9 program. Nathan acknowledged the instructions and collected his cleaning cart from the storage room, checking to make sure it was stocked with the supplies he'd need for the tasks ahead. The routine was familiar enough that he could perform it without conscious thought, which was useful because it allowed his mind to wander to things that mattered more than whether he had enough disinfectant to clean 12 bathrooms. He thought about Lily and about whether $45 for a field trip was an expense he could justify when his truck needed an oil change, and the rent was due in 2 weeks, and the electricity bill had been higher than usual last month because Seattle had experienced an unusual cold snap that had required running the space heater in Lily's bedroom. He thought about Claire and about the promise he'd made to let Lily fly, and he wondered whether working at an aerospace company where she could breathe the same air as the machines counted as keeping that promise, or whether it was just another rationalization for a life that had gotten so far off course that he couldn't remember what the original trajectory had looked like. The morning passed in a blur of repetitive tasks that required physical effort but minimal mental engagement. Nathan cleaned 3 conference rooms and 2 executive bathrooms and mopped the hallway that connected the administrative wing to the engineering section. He emptied trash cans and replaced the paper towels and dispensers and scrubbed the break room sink until the stainless steel gleamed under the fluorescent lights. At 11:30, he took his lunch break in the basement cafeteria that served the maintenance and production staff. The cafeteria was crowded and loud and smelled like industrial-grade pizza and overcooked vegetables, but the food was subsidized by the company and cost less than bringing lunch from home would have cost. Nathan bought a slice of pizza and a cup of coffee and found an empty table near the window that looked out onto the loading dock where trucks were being loaded with crates destined for military installations whose locations were classified. He was halfway through the pizza when Walter Hayes appeared with his own tray and asked if the seat across from Nathan was taken. Nathan shook his head and gestured to the empty chair, and Walter sat with the careful movements of someone whose body reminded him daily that he was no longer young. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes before Walter spoke. "Your daughter has quite a talent for engineering. That drawing she was working on yesterday showed a level of spatial reasoning that most people don't develop until college, if they develop it at all." Nathan swallowed his bite of pizza and considered how to respond without revealing too much about Lily's unconventional education, which consisted primarily of her teaching herself from resources she wasn't technically supposed to have access to. She likes airplanes, spends a lot of time drawing them and figuring out how they work. Walter nodded and took a sip of his coffee before responding. "My granddaughter is the same age as Lily, and she spends her time drawing princesses and unicorns. Which is fine, but it makes me wonder what Lily is exposed to that allows her to conceptualize complex mechanical systems at 8 years old." The implicit question hung in the air between them, and Nathan recognized it as the opening move in a conversation that could lead places he couldn't afford to go. He chose his words carefully. Her mother was a nurse. She taught Lily that understanding how things work is important if you wanted to help them when they're broken. I think Lily applies that philosophy to machines the same way her mother applied it to people. Walter absorbed this information with the thoughtful expression of someone who was filing it away for later consideration, and then he changed the subject to the Talon 9 demonstration that was scheduled for Monday morning. The Pentagon had sent a delegation to evaluate whether the prototype met the specifications that had been promised in the initial proposal. And if the demonstration went well, Ashford Aerospace would receive a contract worth $800 million over 5 years. If the demonstration went poorly, the company would lose the contract to a competitor and would likely need to lay off a significant portion of its workforce to remain financially viable. Nathan listened to Walter describe the technical challenges that the engineering team was working to resolve before Monday's demonstration, and he filed away the details even though he had no professional reason to care about fuel efficiency ratios or combustion chamber pressure fluctuations. But old habits were hard to break, and his brain still processed technical information with the automatic competence that came from years of training in systems that could kill you if you didn't understand them completely. After lunch, Nathan returned to his cleaning duties and spent the afternoon working his way through the task list that Carl had given him. By 3 p.m., when the investor tour was scheduled to begin, the executive floor was spotless, and Nathan had moved to the hangar level where the Talon 9 was being prepared for the demonstration. He was mopping near the prototype when the tour group arrived, a cluster of men in expensive suits who were being guided through the facility by Victoria Ashford and several board members. Nathan had learned to make himself invisible during these tours, to keep his eyes down and his movements quiet, so that the visitors wouldn't register his presence except as part of the background machinery that kept the facility running. But invisibility failed when the Victoria decided to use him as a prop in whatever performance she was giving for the investors, and her voice cut through the industrial noise of the hangar with the sharp clarity of someone who was accustomed to being heard. He'd already heard this particular insult yesterday, but hearing it repeated for a different audience made it worse somehow, as if Victoria had decided that humiliating him once hadn't been sufficient, and that she needed to establish a pattern. The investors laughed on cue, and Nathan kept mopping while his jaw clenched hard enough that he could feel his teeth grinding against each other. What Victoria didn't know, what none of them knew, except possibly Walter Hayes, who was beginning to suspect, was that Nathan understood the Talon 9 systems better than most of the engineers who designed it, because the principles underlying its operation were the same principles that had governed every aircraft he'd ever flown. He could see from 30 feet away that the secondary fuel pump mounting was going to cause harmonic vibration at high RPM, and he knew that the combustion chamber pressure readings that were being displayed on the diagnostic screen were fluctuating in a pattern that suggested the bypass valve was degrading faster than the design specifications had predicted. But sharing that knowledge would require revealing expertise that he couldn't afford to reveal, and so he kept mopping and kept silent and waited for the tour group to move on so he could finish his shift and pick up Lily from Mrs. Chen's apartment and make dinner from whatever ingredients he could afford at the grocery store, where he shopped using coupons clipped from the Sunday newspaper. The tour eventually moved past him toward the observation deck, and Nathan returned his attention to the floor that was already clean, but which he continued to mop because standing still would draw attention, and attention was the enemy of invisibility. Behind him, one of the engineers was arguing with a colleague about the pressure readings, and Nathan listened to their debate with half his attention, while the other half focused on counting the minutes until his shift ended. The argument was about whether the fluctuations were significant enough to warrant delaying Monday's demonstration, and the two engineers couldn't agree on whether the risk of failure was acceptable or whether they needed more time to diagnose the underlying problem. Nathan knew without looking at the data more closely that the bypass valve was thermally degrading and that failure during the demonstration would be catastrophic, but sharing that assessment would require explaining how he knew, and explanations led to questions that led to revelations that led to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. He finished mopping and moved his cart toward the service elevator, passing close enough to the diagnostic screen that he could see the pressure readings clearly. The pattern confirmed what he'd suspected, and for a moment he considered walking over to the engineers and telling them what they were looking at and what it meant. But the moment passed and he kept walking, because one of the first lessons you learned after falling from the sky was that some knowledge was more dangerous to share than to keep hidden. The rest of his shift passed without incident, and at 6 p.m. Nathan clocked out and drove to Mrs. Chen's apartment to collect Lily. She was sitting at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table working on her homework, and she looked up when Nathan knocked and entered with a smile that made the entire day worth enduring. They thanked Mrs. Chen and walked down the hallway to their own apartment, and Nathan helped Lily finish her homework, while he thought about whether he could afford to buy her the new shoes she needed because her current pair was wearing through at the toes. That night, after Lily had gone to bed and Nathan was sitting alone in his bedroom, staring at the tattoo on his forearm, he thought about the engineers arguing over the pressure readings and about the demonstration that was scheduled for Monday morning. He thought about what would happen if the bypass valve failed during maximum thrust, and about the fact that failure at that point in the flight envelope would almost certainly result in an explosion that could kill the test pilot and destroy months of work and cost the company a contract that represented the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy. He thought about the 4 men whose names were carved into a memorial wall in Arizona, and about the promise he'd made to make sure their deaths meant something, even if he couldn't explain what they'd actually died for. He thought about Claire and about the promise he'd made to let Lily fly, and about whether keeping that promise required him to protect the company where she spent her afternoons drawing pictures of aircraft that she dreamed about designing someday. And he thought about Victoria Ashford and about the fact that she was trying to prove herself worthy of a legacy that she didn't seem to understand wasn't about proving anything to anyone except yourself. She was making all the mistakes that people made when they confused strength with hardness and leadership with domination. And Nathan recognized those mistakes because he'd made them himself back when he'd been young enough and stupid enough to think that being the best pilot in the squadron meant something more than just being good at not dying. Sleep came late and brought dreams that were darker than usual, and when Nathan woke at 5:30 the next morning, he felt like he'd spent the night fighting instead of resting. He went through his morning routine on automatic pilot, showering and dressing and making coffee while Lily got ready for school. They drove through the dark streets of Seattle toward her school, and Nathan walked her to the entrance and hugged her goodbye and told her that he loved her and that Mrs. Chen would pick her up after school because he had to work late to finish preparing for Monday's demonstration. At Ashford Aerospace, Nathan checked in with Carl Morrison and received his assignment for the day, which included a note that the hangar needed to be immaculate because there would be additional visitors on Friday for a pre-demonstration walkthrough. Nathan acknowledged the instructions and collected his cart and began working through the familiar routine of cleaning and mopping and emptying trash cans. By mid-morning, the engineering team had gathered around the Talon 9 prototype to conduct final systems checks before Monday's demonstration, and their conversation had taken on the urgent tone that people used when they discovered a problem but couldn't agree on its significance or solution. Nathan worked near enough to hear them discussing the pressure fluctuations that had been detected during yesterday's tests, and he listened as they debated whether the readings were within acceptable tolerances or whether they indicated a developing failure that needed to be addressed before the demonstration. Dr. Helen Kim was leading the discussion, and she had the kind of methodical competence that made people listen when she spoke. She was 52 years old and had been designing aircraft propulsion systems for longer than Nathan had been alive, and her assessment of the pressure fluctuations was that they were concerning but not necessarily critical, given that the readings were still within the margins that the design specifications allowed. One of the younger engineers disagreed and argued that the pattern of the fluctuations suggested a thermal degradation problem that would get worse under sustained high-power operation, and his concern was that failure during the demonstration would be catastrophic, both in terms of human safety and in terms of the company's reputation with the Pentagon. Dr. Kim acknowledged his concern, but pointed out that they had less than 72 hours until the demonstration, and that completely diagnosing and repairing a thermal degradation issue would require more time than they had available. The debate continued for another 20 minutes without resolution, and Nathan kept mopping the same section of floor while he listened and felt the tension building in his chest because he knew they were wrong about having time to fix the problem. The bypass valve wasn't going to last 72 hours at the stress levels they were planning to subject it to during final testing, and if it failed during one of those tests, they'd be scrambling to repair or replace components that would take weeks to manufacture and install. He set down his mop and walked toward the group of engineers before he could talk himself out of it, and the conversation stopped as they noticed his approach. Dr. Kim looked at him with polite curiosity, and Nathan felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical pressure against his chest. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended when he spoke. "Excuse me, I think I know what's causing your pressure fluctuations." Metrics words sounded at 9 to 247. Target minimum equals 18,000. Status continuing. The silence that followed Nathan's interruption was the kind of silence that occurred when social boundaries had been crossed, and no one was quite sure how to respond. Dr. Helen Kim's expression shifted from polite curiosity to something that might have been irritation or might have been genuine interest, and the younger engineers exchanged glances that communicated their uncertainty about whether they should be offended that a janitor was offering technical opinions or whether they should listen to what he had to say. Nathan felt the familiar weight of self-consciousness that came from being seen when you'd spent months perfecting the art of invisibility. But the pressure in his chest had transformed into something that felt like obligation. An obligation was harder to ignore than discomfort. He'd spent 6 months watching engineers make decisions that ranged from brilliant to merely competent, and he'd kept his observations to himself because offering them would have required explanations he couldn't provide. But this was different because this was a problem that would kill someone if it wasn't addressed, and Nathan had accumulated enough deaths in his past that adding another one to the list felt intolerable. Dr. Kim was the first to respond, and her voice carried the kind of measured patience that people used when they were being polite but didn't actually want to engage. "I appreciate your concern, but these are complex technical issues that require specialized knowledge to interpret correctly. The pressure fluctuations we're seeing are within normal operating parameters for this stage of development." Nathan had expected this response, and he'd already decided that if they dismissed him immediately, he'd walk away and let them discover the problem on their own when the valve failed during testing, and they had to explain to Victoria Ashford why the demonstration was being delayed. But something in Dr. Kim's tone suggested that she was keeping the door open a crack, that she was willing to listen if he could demonstrate that he had something worth saying. "The secondary bypass valve in your fuel control assembly is thermally deformed. The valve seat isn't sealing properly at low temperatures, and expansion under load is causing pressure oscillations that will get worse as you increase power output. You'll get catastrophic failure at maximum thrust probably within the first 2 minutes of sustained operation. The specificity of his diagnosis created a different kind of silence, one that had nothing to do with social boundaries and everything to do with the fact that he just described a failure mode that required deep understanding of the Talon 9's fuel system architecture. The younger engineer who'd been arguing for more diagnostic testing stepped forward, and his expression had shifted from uncertainty to something that looked like recognition. How do you know that the valve assembly is buried 3 layers deep in the fuel system? You can't see it from outside the housing, and we haven't disassembled it for inspection yet. Nathan had known this question was coming, and he'd prepared an answer that was technically true even if it wasn't complete. I've worked on aircraft engines before. Different platforms, but the principles are the same. The pressure oscillation pattern you're seeing is characteristic of thermal degradation in bypass valves, and the fact that it's worse at low temperatures tells you that the valve seat is contracting unevenly and creating gaps that allow fuel to bypass the pressure regulation system. When you bring the engine up to operating temperature under load, the valve seat will expand, but it won't expand evenly because the thermal deformation has created stress points that will propagate until the seat fractures completely. Dr. Kim's eyes had narrowed during this explanation, and Nathan could see her running through the logic of what he was describing and finding that it matched the evidence they'd collected. She turned to one of the technicians and told him to pull the diagnostic data from the last 3 test runs and to overlay them with thermal imaging if they had it available. The technician nodded and moved toward the computer terminal that controlled the diagnostic systems, and Dr. Varr. Kim returned her attention to Nathan. What's your background? Where did you work on aircraft engines? The question was direct and professional, and Nathan recognized it as the inevitable next step in a conversation that was rapidly moving away from the safe anonymity he'd maintained for 6 months. He chose his words carefully, offering information that was verifiable without being revelatory. I have a degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Washington. After graduation, I worked on military aircraft for about 10 years before transitating to other employment. The phrase military aircraft was deliberately vague, and transition to other employment was a euphemism that covered a decade of pain and loss and rehabilitation. But it was enough to establish that he had relevant credentials, even if he wasn't providing details about what those credentials were or why someone with them was working as a janitor. Dr. Kim absorbed this information with a slight nod, and Nathan could see her making calculations about whether to pursue the obvious questions or whether to focus on the immediate problem. She chose the immediate problem, which was what Nathan had hoped she would do. If you're correct about the thermal deformation, we need to disassemble the valve assembly and inspect it directly. That's going to take at least 4 hours of work, and if we find a problem that requires replacement parts, we won't meet Monday's demonstration schedule. The younger engineer had been working at the computer terminal, and he called out that the diagnostic data was ready for review. Dr. Kim moved to look at the screen, and Nathan followed because he'd already crossed the line that separated observer from participant, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. The screen showed 3 overlaid graphs that tracked pressure fluctuations during the most recent test runs, and the pattern was exactly what Nathan had described. Oscillations that were most pronounced at low temperatures and that decreased as the engine warmed but never completely disappeared. Dr. Kim studied the graphs for nearly a minute before speaking, and when she did, her voice had shifted from polite patience to professional respect. You're right, the pattern is consistent with bypass valve degradation. We need to inspect the assembly immediately. She turned to the technician and gave instructions to begin the disassembly process, and then she looked at Nathan with an expression that combined curiosity with something that might have been gratitude. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. If the valve had failed during the demonstration, we would have lost months of work and possibly the entire Pentagon contract. I don't know what your current role is here, but you just saved this project. Nathan nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond verbally because there was nothing to say that wouldn't lead to more questions, and he was already regretting the exposure that this conversation had created. He returned to his cleaning cart and resumed mopping the floor, but he was aware of the engineers watching him with expressions that had suggested they were reevaluating their assumptions about who he was and why he was working in a role that seemed incongruent with his technical knowledge. Walter Hayes had been standing near the back of the group, and he approached Nathan after the other engineers had returned to their work on the valve assembly. His face was thoughtful, and his eyes held the kind of knowing look that suggested he just had a suspicion confirmed. That was quite a diagnosis. Most people wouldn't be able to identify a thermal deformation problem without taking the valve apart and looking at it directly. You must have seen this kind of failure before. Nathan continued mopping, and his voice was deliberately neutral when he responded. I've seen a lot of things fail in aircraft engines. After a while, you learn to recognize the patterns. Walter nodded slowly, and his expression suggested he was filing away this information along with everything else he'd observed about Nathan over the past few weeks. He didn't push for more details, which Nathan appreciated, because he wasn't sure how much longer he could maintain the deflections before someone asked a question that couldn't be answered without revealing things that were supposed to remain hidden. The rest of the day passed with a different quality of attention than Nathan was accustomed to experiencing. Engineers who'd previously walked past him without acknowledgement now nodded when they saw him, and several of them stopped to thank him for identifying the valve problem before it could cause catastrophic failure during testing. The attention made Nathan uncomfortable because attention led to curiosity, and curiosity led to questions, but he accepted the thanks with brief nods and returned to his cleaning duties as quickly as possible. By 4 p.m., the valve assembly had been disassembled and inspected, and the results confirmed everything Nathan had predicted. The valve seat showed clear evidence of thermal deformation, with stress fractures radiating from 3 distinct points where the material had contracted unevenly during cooling cycles. Kim called a meeting with the senior engineering staff to discuss options for repair or replacement, and the consensus was that they needed to order a new valve assembly from the manufacturer, and that delivery would take at least 5 days, which meant postponing Monday's demonstration by a week. Victoria Ashford was informed of the delay, and she called an emergency meeting with the board members to discuss the implications for their contract negotiations with the Pentagon. Nathan wasn't present for that meeting, but he heard about it afterward from Carl Morrison, who'd heard about it from one of the administrative assistants who'd been taking notes. According to the assistant, Victoria had been furious about the delay, but had acknowledged that discovering the problem before the demonstration was better than having the engine explode in front of Pentagon officials. Richard Thornton, the VP of Operations, who'd been among the board members on the tour that had resulted in Nathan's public humiliation, had apparently used the meeting as an opportunity to question Victoria's leadership and to suggest that better project management would have identified the valve problem during earlier stages of development. The assistant reported that Victoria had responded by pointing out that the problem had been identified by someone that Richard himself had mocked as being unqualified to understand complex systems, and that perhaps Richard's judgment about people's competence wasn't as reliable as he thought it was. Nathan heard this account while he was emptying trash cans on the executive floor, and he felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and concern, because Victoria's defense of him would likely make Richard Thornton pay more attention to who Nathan was and why he'd been able to diagnose a problem that had eluded the engineering team. Attention from someone like Thornton was dangerous because people in positions of power tended to use that power to eliminate threats to their status, and Nathan had just inadvertently positioned himself as someone whose competence made Thornton look incompetent by comparison. He pushed the concern aside and focused on finishing his shift so he could pick up Lily from Mrs. Chen's apartment and take her home for dinner and homework and the evening ritual of stories about flying that helped her fall asleep. But as he worked, he was aware of the fact that something had shifted in his carefully maintained invisibility, and that the shift was probably irreversible, regardless of how much he might wish otherwise. At 6 p.m., Nathan clocked out and drove to Mrs. Chen's apartment, where he found Lily sitting at the kitchen table working on a drawing that showed a modified version of the Talon 9's fuel system with annotations that explained how moving the bypass valve to a different location in the assembly would reduce thermal stress during heating and cooling cycles. The sophistication of the analysis made Nathan's chest tighten because his 8-year-old daughter was solving engineering problems that professional engineers with advanced degrees were struggling with, and he had no idea how to help her develop that gift without exposing her to the kind of scrutiny that would raise questions about where she'd learned to think like this. Mrs. Chen noticed his expression and offered him tea with the gentle insistence that elderly Chinese women used when they decided someone needed taking care of. Nathan accepted the tea and sat at the table while Lily explained her drawing in detail, and he listened with the attention he always gave her when she was talking about things that mattered to her. When she finished her explanation, he told her that her solution was elegant and that the engineers at Ashford Aerospace would be lucky to have someone with her insight working on their project someday. They thanked Mrs. Chen and returned to their own apartment, and Nathan heated leftover stir-fry for dinner, while Lily set the table with the careful precision she brought to everything. They ate together while Lily told him about her day at school, and Nathan listened to stories about a science project she was working on and about a boy in her class who tried to pull her hair during recess until she told him that if he touched her again, she'd explain to everyone why his understanding of basic physics was wrong. Nathan smiled at this because Lily had inherited Claire's refusal to tolerate nonsense from people who thought they could intimidate her, and he was grateful that she had that strength, even if it sometimes got her into situations that required parental intervention. After dinner, they worked on homework together, and then Nathan tucked her into bed and told her a story about a training flight where he'd chased another pilot through a canyon in Arizona and had discovered that the other pilot was actually better at high-speed maneuvering than he was, which had been a humbling experience that had made him a better pilot. When Lily was asleep, Nathan returned to his bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed while he thought about the day's events and about the fact that he'd broken his own rule about remaining invisible. He'd done it for good reasons, and the outcome had been positive, in the sense that he'd prevented a catastrophic failure that could have killed someone, but positive outcomes didn't change the fact that he'd exposed himself to scrutiny that would inevitably lead to questions. He rolled up his sleeve and looked at the tattoo that marked him as someone who'd belonged to a unit that officially didn't exist anymore. And he thought about the men whose names were on a memorial wall in Arizona and about whether they would have approved of his decision to stay silent for 6 months, or whether they would have been disappointed that he'd prioritized his own safety over the opportunity to use his knowledge to prevent harm. The question didn't have an easy answer, and Nathan had learned a long time ago that most important questions didn't, which was one of the reasons he'd stopped asking them. He pulled down his sleeve and lay back on the bed, and he stared at the ceiling while he waited for sleep to come and bring with it the dreams that were his constant companions. Friday morning arrived with rain that drummed against the windows hard enough to wake Nathan 15 minutes before his alarm was scheduled to go off. He lay in bed listening to the rain and thinking about the fact that the valve assembly was being shipped overnight from the manufacturer and would arrive sometime today, and that the engineering team would spend the weekend installing it and running tests to make sure it functioned properly before Monday's rescheduled demonstration. He got up and went through his morning routine, and by the time Lily woke up, he'd already showered and made coffee and was sitting at the table reviewing the bills that needed to be paid before the end of the month. The rent was due in 12 days, and the electricity bill was higher than expected because November had been cold enough to require running the space heater more often than usual. He had enough to cover both bills if he was careful about groceries and if he didn't encounter any unexpected expenses, but the margin was thin enough that he felt the familiar anxiety that came from living paycheck to paycheck. Lily emerged from her bedroom wearing her school uniform and carrying her backpack, and she sat at the table and poured herself cereal while Nathan put away the bills and tried to shift his attention to the present moment. They ate breakfast together in companionable silence, and then Nathan drove her to school through rain that had intensified to the point where the windshield wipers could barely keep up with the deluge. At Ashford Aerospace, Nathan checked in with Carl Morrison and received his assignment for the day, which was lighter than usual because the engineering team was focused on the valve assembly installation and didn't want custodial staff working in the hangar while they were conducting precision work on the Talon 9's fuel system. This meant Nathan would be spending most of his shift on the executive floor and in the administrative wing, which was generally quieter and required less physical labor than the hangar work. He collected his cart and began working through the task list, starting with the conference rooms that were scheduled to be used for meetings later in the morning. The work was routine and required minimal thought, which gave his mind freedom to wander to things that mattered more than whether the whiteboards were clean or whether the coffee station was fully stocked with supplies. He thought about Lillian, about whether he should encourage her interest in aerospace engineering, or whether he should try to steer her toward fields that wouldn't require her to navigate the kind of institutional barriers that made careers in technical disciplines difficult for people who didn't fit the expected demographic profile. He thought about Claire and about whether she would be proud of the way he was raising their daughter, or whether she'd be disappointed that he'd allowed himself to become invisible instead of finding ways to use his skills and experience to build something meaningful. The thoughts circled without resolution, and Nathan pushed them aside and focused on the physical work that at least had the virtue of producing visible results. By noon, he'd cleaned 6 conference rooms and 3 bathrooms and had mopped the hallway that connected the executive offices to the engineering wing. He took his lunch break in the basement cafeteria, and he was halfway through a sandwich when Walter Hayes appeared with his lunch tray and asked if he could join Nathan at the table. They ate in silence for several minutes before Walter spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been thinking carefully about what he wanted to say. I've been doing some research about Greyhawk Squadron. There isn't much publicly available information because most of it is still classified, but I found enough to piece together a general timeline of their operations. They were active from 2005 to 2010, mostly operating out of bases in the Middle East and conducting missions that were never officially acknowledged. According to the records I could find, the squadron was disbanded after a training accident in Nevada that resulted in multiple casualties. Nathan set down his sandwich and met Walter's eyes, and he didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't confirm or deny what Walter was clearly suspecting. Walter held his gaze for a moment and then continued. What's interesting is that the official casualty list doesn't include names, just the number of personnel lost, which is unusual for military records, even when the operations are classified. It's almost like they wanted to create uncertainty about who actually died and who might have survived, but needed to disappear for operational security reasons. The implication hung in the air between them, and Nathan felt the familiar tension that came from being close to a revelation that could change everything. He chose his words carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" Walter's expression softened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine compassion rather than the prosecutorial edge that Nathan had been expecting. "Because I think you're carrying a burden that you shouldn't have to carry alone, and because I think you've been invisible for long enough. I don't know your whole story, and I don't need to know it unless you want to tell me. But I do know that someone with your expertise and your character deserves better than to spend his life cleaning floors, while people like Richard Thornton treat him like he's beneath notice." Nathan felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd built around himself over the past 6 years. He wanted to tell Walter everything, to share the weight of the memories that woke him up at night, and the guilt that came from having survived when other men had died, and the fear that he'd never be able to give Lily the life she deserved because he'd made choices that had closed doors that could never be reopened. But wanting to tell someone and actually telling them were different things, and Nathan had learned through painful experience that sharing burdens often just meant spreading the pain to people who didn't deserve to carry it. So he swallowed the words that wanted to emerge and gave Walter the only response he could manage. "I appreciate your concern, but there are some things that are better left in the past where they belong." Walter nodded slowly, and his expression suggested he'd expected this response and wasn't particularly surprised by it. "Fair enough, but the offer stands if you ever change your mind." And for what it's worth, Robert Ashford kept a journal where he wrote about the people and events that mattered to him. "I was his friend for 30 years, and after he died, his lawyer gave me access to some of his personal papers, because Robert had specified that I should have them." One of the entries from 2009 describes an emergency landing in Nevada where a pilot saved his life during a sandstorm. Robert spent years trying to find that pilot because he wanted to thank him properly, but the military told him the pilot was dead. The words hit Nathan like a physical blow, and he felt the ground shift beneath him as the careful separation he'd maintained between his past and his present collapsed into something he couldn't control. Walter was watching him with the kind of attention that missed nothing, and Nathan knew that whatever he said next would confirm or deny the connection that Walter had already made. He chose silence, which was its own form of confirmation, and Walter nodded as if Nathan had spoken aloud. "Robert would have wanted you to know that he never forgot what you did for him, and that he considered it one of the defining moments of his life. He built this company on the belief that people who were brave enough to risk everything to save others deserved to work in an environment that respected that courage. I think he'd be disappointed to learn that his daughter has been treating you the way she has, and I think he'd want me to do something about it." Nathan's throat was too tight to respond, and he was grateful when Walter stood and collected his tray and left the table without requiring any further conversation. He sat alone in the cafeteria for another 10 minutes, staring at the remains of his sandwich and trying to process the fact that Robert Ashford had known who saved him and had spent years looking for Nathan, even after being told that Nathan was dead. The knowledge created a sense of obligation that Nathan didn't know how to fulfill, because fulfilling it would require revealing himself in ways that would expose Lily to attention that she didn't need and that Nathan couldn't protect her from. But the alternative was to continue hiding, and hiding suddenly felt like a form of dishonor toward a man who'd valued courage enough to build a company around it. Nathan returned to work with a heaviness in his chest that made the physical labor feel more difficult than usual, and he moved through the afternoon in a state of distraction that resulted in him having to re-clean a bathroom because he'd missed spots the first time through. By 4 p.m., the rain had stopped and pale sunlight was breaking through the clouds, and Nathan took a moment to stand at a window and look out over the Seattle skyline while he thought about choices and consequences and the fact that every decision he made had implications that extended beyond his own life into Lily's future. At 6 p.m., he clocked out and drove to Mrs. Chen's apartment to pick up Lily, and he found her sitting at the kitchen table working on homework while Mrs. Chen prepared dinner in the kitchen. The smell of cooking made Nathan's stomach growl because he'd barely eaten anything at lunch, and Mrs. Chen noticed and insisted that they stay for dinner because she'd made more than enough food for one person, and it would be a shame to let it go to waste. They ate together at Mrs. Chen's table, and the conversation was light and pleasant in a way that felt like a brief respite from the weight Nathan had been carrying all day. Lily talked about her science project and about the Museum of Flight field trip that was scheduled for next week, and Mrs. Chen told stories about her grandchildren that were equal parts exasperation and affection. Nathan listened and contributed when appropriate, and he felt grateful for the simple normalcy of sharing a meal with people who cared about him and Lily without requiring explanations or justifications. After dinner, they returned to their own apartment, and Nathan helped Lily with the last of her homework before tucking her into bed and telling her a story about a formation flight where he and 3 other pilots had flown so close together that their wingtips were separated by less than 3 feet, and how the precision required to maintain that formation had taught him that trust was more important than skill when you were operating at the edge of what was possible. Lily asked her usual question about why he'd stopped flying, and Nathan gave his usual answer about landing so someone else could take off. But the words felt less adequate than they usually did, because Walter's revelation about Robert Ashford had reminded him that some debts couldn't be repaid through silence and invisibility. When Lily was asleep, Nathan sat in his bedroom and stared at the tattoo on his forearm while he thought about the fact that Monday's demonstration was going to bring Pentagon officials to Ashford Aerospace, and that those officials would include people who might recognize him if they looked closely enough. The thought created anxiety that he couldn't quite suppress because recognition would lead to questions that would lead to revelations that would change everything about the life he'd built for himself and Lily. He pulled down his sleeve and lay back on the bed, and he tried to convince himself that the demonstration would go smoothly and that the Pentagon officials would be focused on the Talon 9's performance, rather than on the custodial staff who would be working in the background. The self-deception was thin enough that it didn't provide much comfort, but it was better than the alternative, which was acknowledging that he'd set events in motion that he couldn't control and that the consequences were going to arrive whether he was ready for them or not. Saturday arrived without rain, which was unusual enough for November in Seattle, that Nathan took it as a good sign even though he didn't really believe in signs. He spent the morning doing laundry in the building's basement laundry room, while Lily read a book about Amelia Earhart that she'd checked out from the school library. The book was written for adults rather than children, but Lily was reading at a level that was several years ahead of her age, and she developed a particular interest in aviation pioneers who'd pushed boundaries that other people had considered impossible. In the afternoon, Nathan took Lily to the Museum of Flight, even though the official field trip wasn't scheduled until next week because he wanted to give her the experience without the pressure of being surrounded by her classmates and their parents, who would inevitably ask questions about what Nathan did for a living and why he was working as a janitor, instead of using his aerospace engineering degree. They spent 3 hours walking through exhibits that showed the evolution of aircraft, from the Wright brothers' first flight to modern military jets, and Lily asked questions that demonstrated she understood concepts that most adults would struggle with. Nathan answered her questions with the kind of detailed explanations that he'd once given to junior pilots who were learning systems that could kill him if they didn't understand the underlying principles, and he felt a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow because his daughter was brilliant and passionate about the same things he'd been passionate about, and he didn't know how to give her the opportunities she deserved. In the evening, they made dinner together in their small kitchen, and Nathan taught Lily how to cook rice properly by using the ratio of water to rice that his own mother had taught him years ago. They ate while watching a documentary about the Apollo space program, and Lily asked whether Nathan thought she could become an astronaut someday. He told her that if she worked hard and believed in herself, she could become anything she wanted to become, and he tried not to think about all the ways that statement was both true and inadequate. Sunday passed in similar fashion with quiet domestic activities that felt precious because Nathan knew from experience that peaceful moments were temporary and that storms always arrived eventually, no matter how carefully you tried to prepare for them. They went grocery shopping in the morning and cleaned the apartment in the afternoon, and Nathan paid the bills that were due and calculated that he'd have enough money left over to cover the field trip cost if he skipped buying himself lunch at work for the next 2 weeks. That night, after Lily was asleep, Nathan sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter that he didn't intend to send, but which he needed to write anyway. The letter was addressed to Lieutenant Derek Stone, the wingman, whose life Nathan had saved during the Nevada mission that had ended his flying career, and it explained everything that had happened in the 6 years since they'd last seen each other. He wrote about Claire's death and about Lily's brilliance and about the fact that working as a janitor at an aerospace company felt like a particular kind of purgatory where he was close enough to the sky to remember what he'd lost, but far enough away that he'd never touch it again. When the letter was finished, Nathan folded it and put it in an envelope that he tucked into the back of his sock drawer where Lily wouldn't find it. The act of writing had provided a small measure of relief, like lancing a wound that had been festering too long, and he went to bed feeling slightly less burdened than he had when the day began. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Seattle feel like a different city, all clean air and sharp light that transformed the ordinary into something beautiful. Nathan woke before his alarm and lay in bed listening to Lily's quiet breathing from her room down the hall. And he thought about the fact that today's demonstration would either secure Ashford Aerospace's future or doom it to bankruptcy and layoffs that would cost hundreds of people their jobs, including his own. He got up and went through his morning routine with extra care, making sure his uniform was clean and his appearance was as professional as someone in his position could manage. He made coffee and toast for breakfast, and when Lily woke up, he helped her get ready for school, while he explained that he'd be working late because the demonstration was happening today and there would be visitors who needed the facility to be immaculate. Mrs. Chen knocked on the door at 7 a.m. earlier than usual because she'd agreed to take Lily to school so Nathan could get to work in time to help with the final preparations. Nathan thanked her and hugged Lily goodbye, and he told her that he loved her and that he'd see her after school when Mrs. Chen brought her to the facility like she usually did on Mondays. The drive to Ashford Aerospace took longer than expected because traffic was heavy with commuters heading into downtown Seattle, but Nathan arrived with enough time to check in with Carl Morrison and collect his assignment for the day. The hangar needed to be spotless, and the observation deck needed to be prepared for the Pentagon delegation that would arrive at 2 p.m. to watch the demonstration. Nathan worked alongside 3 other custodial staff members to clean and prepare the facility, and by noon, everything was ready. The Talon 9 sat on its test rig gleaming under the industrial lights, and the new bypass valve had been installed and tested and had performed flawlessly during the preliminary runs that the engineering team had conducted over the weekend. Dr. Helen Kim was overseeing the final system checks, and when she saw Nathan working nearby, she walked over and thanked him again for identifying the valve problem before it could cause a catastrophic failure. Her gratitude was genuine and professional, and Nathan accepted it with a nod that acknowledged the thanks without encouraging further conversation. At 1:30 p.m., the Pentagon delegation arrived in 3 black SUVs that parked near the main entrance. Nathan watched from a distance as Victoria Ashford greeted the visitors and guided them toward the observation deck, and he recognized several of the faces as people he'd briefed during his time in the Air Force, though none of them were likely to recognize him in return because he'd changed enough in 6 years that he barely recognized himself. The demonstration was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m., and Nathan positioned himself near the back of the hangar where he could watch without being conspicuous. The observation deck filled with Pentagon officials and board members and journalists who'd been invited to document what Ashford Aerospace hoped would be a triumph of American engineering excellence. Victoria stood at a podium and delivered a speech that touched on themes of innovation and national security and the importance of maintaining technological superiority over potential adversaries. Her voice was confident and her presence was commanding, and Nathan thought about the fact that she was trying to live up to a legacy that her father had built through different means than she was employing. When the speech concluded, the demonstration began. The Talon 9's engine ignited with a roar that shook the hangar's walls, and the sound was beautiful in the way that perfectly engineered machines were beautiful when they were performing exactly as designed. The thrust output climbed steadily, and the diagnostic screen showed that all parameters were within expected tolerances. For 90 seconds, everything was perfect. The pressure readings were stable, the fuel consumption was efficient, and the power output exceeded the projections that had been promised in the initial contract proposal. The Pentagon officials were nodding approvingly, and the journalists were taking notes, and Victoria was allowing herself a small smile that suggested relief that the demonstration was proceeding without incident. Then at 91 seconds, something changed. The pressure reading spiked suddenly, and an alarm began to shriek with an urgency that cut through the engine's roar. Smoke poured from the combustion chamber in thick black clouds that billowed upward toward the hangar's ceiling, and sparks began to explode outward from the test rig in patterns that suggested electrical systems were failing catastrophically. The test operator initiated emergency shutdown procedures, but the engine didn't respond to the commands because the failure had already progressed beyond the point where automated safeties could prevent disaster. A second explosion rocked the test rig, and suddenly the auxiliary fuel line that fed the combustion chamber ruptured and ignited, creating a wall of flame that spread across the hangar floor toward the observation deck. People screamed and began running toward the exits, and security personnel rushed forward with fire extinguishers that were inadequate for the scale of the blaze. The sprinkler system activated and began dumping water onto the fire, but the fuel was burning too hot for water to be effective, and the flames continued to spread toward the observation deck, where the Pentagon officials were being evacuated by their security details. Nathan's training took over before his conscious mind could process what was happening. He ran toward the fire instead of away from it, and his eyes scanned the hangar for anyone who might be trapped or injured. Through the smoke, he saw a young engineer named Kyle Martinez, who'd been working near the test rig when the explosion occurred. Kyle was on the ground with his leg trapped under a support beam that had collapsed during the blast, and the flames were spreading toward him with the inexorable logic of physics that didn't care about human survival. Nathan grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed a path through the flames, and the heat was intense enough that he could feel his skin burning even through his uniform. He reached Kyle and knelt beside him, and Kyle's face was twisted with pain and terror in equal measure. Nathan assessed the situation in the fraction of a second that training had taught him to use for life and death decisions, and he saw that the beam was heavy enough that lifting it would require strength he wasn't sure his damaged spine could provide. But the alternative was leaving Kyle to burn, and Nathan had left too many people behind already, and so he positioned himself and gripped the beam and lifted with every bit of force his body could generate. Pain shot through his lower back with an intensity that made his vision narrow and his legs shake, but the beam moved upward just enough that Kyle could pull his leg free. Nathan dragged Kyle away from the flames toward the exit where emergency responders were arriving with equipment designed to handle industrial fires. He got Kyle to safety and was turning to go back into the hangar to look for anyone else who might need help when someone grabbed his arm and pulled him back with force that nearly knocked him off his feet. It was Victoria Ashford, and her face was pale with shock, and her eyes were wide with the kind of fear that came from watching everything you'd worked for collapse in flames. She was saying something about not going back in, about letting the professionals handle it, but Nathan couldn't hear her clearly over the ringing in his ears that had started when the second explosion had detonated too close to where he had been standing. The fire suppression foam system activated, and thick white foam began to pour from nozzles in the ceiling, smothering the flames with chemical compounds designed specifically for aviation fuel fires. The smoke began to dissipate, and Nathan could see that the damage was extensive but not total. The test rig was destroyed, and the Talon 9 prototype was damaged beyond immediate repair. But the hangar structure was intact, and no one appeared to be seriously injured, except possibly Kyle, who was being loaded into an ambulance with an oxygen mask over his face. Nathan became aware that Victoria was still holding his arm, and that she was staring at him with an expression that he couldn't quite interpret. He tried to pull away because the attention was uncomfortable, and because his back was screaming at him with pain that suggested he'd torn something during the lifting, but Victoria's grip tightened, and she pulled him toward the exit and away from the crowd of emergency responders who were working to contain the remaining fires. Outside the hangar, the air was cold and clean and tasted like salvation after the smoke and chemical foam. Nathan's jacket was torn and scorched, and his right sleeve had separated from the shoulder seam during the rescue, leaving his forearm exposed to the afternoon light. He looked down and saw that the tattoo was visible, the steel wings and the Latin inscription standing out stark against his skin. Victoria saw it at the same moment Nathan did, and her expression changed from shock to recognition to something that might have been understanding. She released his arm and took a step back, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only Nathan could hear. Per aspera ad astra, through hardships to the stars. That's the Greyhawk Squadron motto. Nathan didn't respond because there was nothing to say that wouldn't confirm what Victoria had already figured out, and confirmation would lead to questions that would lead to revelations that would change everything. But Victoria wasn't waiting for confirmation, and her next words made it clear that she'd already connected the pieces into a complete picture. You're the one who saved my father. The words hung between them in the cold Seattle afternoon air, while emergency vehicles continued to arrive with sirens that cut through the sound of water still pouring from the sprinkler system. Nathan's exposed forearm felt like a brand that had marked him as something other than the invisible custodian he'd spent 6 months pretending to be, and Victoria's eyes held a recognition that went beyond the simple identification of a tattoo. Nathan pulled his arm away and tried to adjust the torn sleeve to cover the tattoo, but the fabric was too damaged to provide any real concealment. Around them, Pentagon officials were being evacuated to their vehicles by security personnel who determined that the facility was no longer safe for visitors, and journalists were being escorted to a designated area where Victoria's communications director would provide them with an official statement about what had happened and what it meant for the Talon 9 program. Victoria stepped closer to Nathan, and her voice dropped to a level that was meant only for him. My father kept a journal. He wrote about the emergency landing in Nevada, about the pilot who talked him through a sandstorm when his aircraft was failing and every instrument was telling him to give up. He wrote that he owed his life to someone named Captain Nathan Cross, and that he'd spent years trying to find you so he could say thank you properly. The military told him you were dead. Nathan's throat constricted around words that wouldn't come, and he was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Walter Hayes, who'd been helping coordinate the evacuation, and who now approached with concern visible on his weathered face. Walter's eyes went to the exposed tattoo and then to Nathan's face, and something passed between them that confirmed what Walter had already suspected. I need to get him checked by the paramedics. He went into a burning hangar and lifted a support beam off Kyle Martinez, and I'm concerned about smoke inhalation and potential back injury. Victoria nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on Nathan. Of course, but afterward we need to talk. My office whenever the paramedics clear you. Nathan allowed Walter to guide him toward one of the ambulances where EMTs were treating minor injuries sustained during the evacuation. The assessment was quick and professional. His lungs were clear. Despite smoke exposure, the burns on his hands were superficial and would heal without scarring, and his back showed evidence of muscle strain, but no obvious structural damage that would require immediate medical intervention. They gave him oxygen and bandaged his hands and recommended that he follow up with his primary care physician within 48 hours, and then they released him with instructions to rest and to return to the emergency room if he experienced any worsening symptoms. Walter stayed with him throughout the examination, and when the EMTs had finished, Walter guided Nathan away from the crowd toward his truck in the parking lot. They sat in the truck's cab with the doors closed, and Walter's expression carried the weight of everything he'd pieced together over the past week. I know who you are. I've known since I saw that photo from 2012, but I wasn't certain until today. Captain Nathan Cross, Greyhawk Squadron, United States Air Force. Officially declared killed in action during a training accident in Nevada in 2010, but actually alive and working as a custodian at the company owned by the man whose life you saved during that same mission. Nathan leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes while pain radiated from his lower back with each breath. Robert Ashford was on a test flight when his aircraft experienced hydraulic failure during a sandstorm. He was a civilian contractor, not military, and he shouldn't have been anywhere near that airspace during a classified operation. But he was there, and his plane was going down, and I was the closest pilot with the fuel and the clearance to talk him through an emergency landing that had maybe a 20% chance of success. The memory came back with unwanted clarity, Robert's voice over the radio trying to stay calm, while his instruments failed one by one, and the sandstorm turned visibility to zero. Nathan had stayed with him for 47 minutes, guiding him through procedures that Robert had only read about in manuals, talking him through the fear that came from knowing that death was a statistical probability rather than a remote possibility. When Robert's wheels had finally touched down on a makeshift runway that was barely long enough for the landing, Nathan had felt the kind of relief that came from snatching someone back from the edge of oblivion. 2 hours later, Nathan's own aircraft had been hit by surface-to-air fire from hostiles, who'd been tracking the radio transmissions, and he'd ejected at an altitude that was too low for safe deployment of the parachute. The impact with the cliff face had shattered his L3 and L4 vertebrae and had ended his flying career in the same instant that it had saved his life. Walter absorbed this information with the calm of someone who'd survived enough combat to understand that heroism and tragedy were often separated by margins too thin to measure. Robert tried to find you. He used every contact he had in the military and the defense industry, and he was told repeatedly that Captain Nathan Cross had died during a training accident and that his remains had been buried with full military honors. Robert never believed it, but he couldn't prove otherwise, and eventually he stopped asking because the questions were causing problems for people who'd helped him. The knowledge that Robert had tried to find him created a complicated mixture of guilt and gratitude in Nathan's chest. He'd spent 6 years believing that the silence he'd maintained was protecting Lily from scrutiny that would have made her life harder. But maybe that silence had also been a form of cowardice that had prevented him from honoring the man who'd spent years searching for someone to thank. Victoria needs to know the full story, not because she deserves to invade your privacy, but because understanding what her father valued might help her become the kind of leader he wanted her to be. Nathan opened his eyes and looked at Walter. If I tell her, she'll ask questions I can't answer without revealing classified information. And revealing that information could put other people at risk. Walter nodded slowly. Then tell her what you can and trust that she's smart enough to fill in the blanks without needing details that could compromise national security. She's trying to live up to a legacy she doesn't fully understand, and knowing that her father's life was saved by someone who later worked in her company without recognition might change her perspective on what leadership actually means. Before Nathan could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen showed Mrs. Chen's number, and Nathan answered with the automatic fear that came from being a single parent whose child was in someone else's care. Mrs. Chen's voice was tight with worry. Nathan, Lily has a fever. It started about an hour ago and it's getting worse. She says her head hurts and she feels sick to her stomach. I gave her ibuprofen, but her temperature is still climbing. I think you should come home. Nathan's world narrowed to the single point of concern that overrode everything else. He told Mrs. Chen he was leaving immediately and ended the call, and Walter saw the change in his expression and asked what was wrong. Nathan explained while he started the truck's engine, and Walter told him to go and that they'd continue their conversation later. The drive from Ashford Aerospace to Beacon Hill normally took 25 minutes, but Nathan made it in 18 by taking risks with traffic lights and speed limits that he wouldn't normally have considered. When he arrived at his apartment building, he took the stairs 2 at a time despite the pain in his back, and he found Mrs. Chen waiting at his door with Lily wrapped in a blanket on the couch. Lily's face was flushed with fever, and her eyes were glassy with the kind of disorientation that came from a body fighting an infection it couldn't identify. Nathan touched her forehead and felt heat that was far beyond what over-the-counter medication could address. He thanked Mrs. Chen and told her he was taking Lily to the emergency room, and Mrs. Chen pressed a container of soup into his hands and told him to call her if he needed anything at all. Nathan carried Lily down to the truck and secured her in the passenger seat with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she leaned against him while he drove towards Seattle Children's Hospital with emergency flashers activated and his hand on the horn whenever traffic didn't move fast enough. Lily was quiet during the drive, which was more concerning than if she'd been crying or complaining, because Lily's silence usually meant she was too sick to articulate what she was feeling. At the hospital, Nathan carried her through the emergency entrance and told the triage nurse that his daughter had a fever of unknown origin and was becoming increasingly disoriented. The nurse took Lily's temperature and found it was 104.2 degrees Fahrenheit, which was high enough to warrant immediate attention. They were taken to an examination room where a pediatric emergency physician performed a rapid assessment and ordered blood work and a chest x-ray and a lumbar puncture to rule out meningitis. The lumbar puncture was the worst part because Lily had to curl into a fetal position while a needle was inserted between her vertebrae to extract cerebrospinal fluid for analysis, and Nathan had to hold her still while she cried and asked him why the doctors were hurting her. He explained that the test was necessary to figure out what was making her sick and that being brave for a few minutes would help the doctors help her, and Lily nodded and pressed her face against his chest and tried not to scream when the needle went in. After the procedure, they were moved to a private room in the pediatric observation unit where Lily would stay while they waited for test results. Nathan sat beside her bed and held her hand while she drifted in and out of fevered sleep, and he thought about all the times Claire had sat in the hospital rooms holding patients' hands and offering comfort to people who were frightened and in pain. Claire had been good at that kind of compassion, at finding words that made unbearable situations slightly more bearable, and Nathan had never developed that skill because his training had been about maintaining calm in crisis rather than about providing emotional support. Hours passed with the slow inexorability of time that refused to be hurried regardless of how desperately you wanted answers. Nurses came and went, checking Lily's vital signs and adjusting her IV fluids and offering Nathan coffee that he accepted because drinking it gave him something to do with his hands. At some point, he realized he hadn't eaten since breakfast, but the thought of food made his stomach turn because worry had displaced hunger as his primary physical sensation. At 11 p.m., Dr. Sarah Okonkwo entered the room with a tablet containing Lily's test results. She was in her late 40s with the kind of calm competence that came from years of delivering difficult news to frightened parents, and her voice was gentle when she explained that the lumbar puncture had confirmed viral meningitis rather than bacterial, which was better news than it could have been, but still serious enough to require close monitoring. The fever should come down over the next 24 to 48 hours with supportive care, but we want to keep Lily here for observation to make sure she doesn't develop complications. Viral meningitis can be unpredictable, and children her age are particularly vulnerable to dehydration and secondary infections. Nathan nodded understanding while his mind calculated the cost of a hospital stay that would include specialists and observation and medications that his basic insurance coverage probably wouldn't fully cover. Dr. Okonkwo seemed to read his expression because her next question was about his insurance situation, and Nathan explained that he had coverage through his employer, but that it was minimal and didn't include pediatric specialists. Dr. Okonkwo's sympathetic expression told him everything he needed to know about what this hospital stay was going to cost, and Nathan felt the familiar weight of financial anxiety settling over him like a physical burden. He thanked her for the information and asked if there were any payment plans available for costs that exceeded his insurance coverage, and she assured him that the hospital's billing department would work with him to arrange something manageable. After Dr. Okonkwo left, Nathan sat beside Lily's bed and watched her sleep while he tried to calculate how many extra shifts he'd need to work to cover the bills that would arrive in the coming weeks. The math was depressing because even working every available hour wouldn't be sufficient to cover both the hospital costs and the regular expenses of rent and utilities and food, which meant he'd need to find additional work or apply for assistance programs that required documentation and time and energy he didn't have. He was deep in these calculations when Victoria Ashford appeared in the doorway of Lily's room. She was still wearing the suit she'd worn for the demonstration, though it was now stained with soot and water damage, and her expression carried something that might have been concern or might have been the same obligation that Nathan felt about debts that couldn't be repaid through ordinary means. "I called the hospital to find out if you'd brought your daughter in. The front desk told me she'd been admitted to pediatric observation, and I wanted to check on both of you." Nathan stood from the chair beside Lily's bed, and his back protested the movement with sharp pain that made him grimace despite his attempt to hide it. Victoria noticed and gestured for him to sit back down. "Don't get up on my account. How is she?" Nathan explained about the viral meningitis and the need for observation, and the fact that his insurance wouldn't cover the specialist care that Lily needed. Victoria listened without interrupting, and when he'd finished, she pulled out her phone and made a call to someone whose name Nathan didn't catch. The conversation was brief and professional, and when Victoria ended the call, she turned to Nathan with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "I've just authorized the addition of your daughter to Ashford Aerospace's executive health plan." It covers all specialists, all medications, and all hospital stays with zero copays and zero deductibles. The coverage is effective immediately and retroactive to today's admission. Nathan stared at her while his brain tried to process what she just said. I can't accept that. I'm a custodian, not an executive, and there's no justification for giving me benefits that are reserved for senior management. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. You saved my father's life 15 years ago. You've saved our Pentagon contract twice in the past week. You ran into a burning hangar today and pulled an engineer out from under a fallen beam at significant risk to your own health. I think that's sufficient justification for providing health coverage for your daughter's medical needs. The words were delivered with the same authority Victoria used when making corporate decisions, and Nathan recognized that arguing would be futile because Victoria had already made up her mind. He swallowed the protest that wanted to emerge and settled for thanking her, and his voice broke slightly when he spoke because the relief of knowing that Lily's care would be covered was overwhelming enough to crack through the composure he'd been maintaining. Victoria sat in the chair on the opposite side of Lily's bed, and for several minutes they sat in silence while machines beeped softly and footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Finally, Victoria spoke, and her voice carried a vulnerability that Nathan hadn't heard from her before. My mother died of cancer when I was 16. I spent weeks sitting in hospital rooms watching her deteriorate, and I remember how helpless I felt, knowing that all the money in the world couldn't save her. My father tried to protect me from seeing how scared he was, but I could tell that losing her was destroying him in ways that went beyond grief. After she died, he changed. He became harder, more focused on work, less willing to show emotion or vulnerability. She paused and looked at Lily's sleeping form. I think I learned from him that showing weakness was dangerous, and that the only way to protect yourself from loss was to never care about anything enough that losing it would destroy you. But watching you with your daughter tonight, I realized that's a terrible way to live. You're terrified right now and you're not trying to hide it, and somehow that makes you seem stronger rather than weaker. Nathan didn't know how to respond to this confession, so he offered the only truth he could articulate. Being afraid for someone you love isn't weakness. It's just proof that you're alive instead of just surviving. Victoria absorbed these words with an expression that suggested they'd touched something she'd been trying to avoid confronting, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Tell me about the Nevada mission. Not the classified details, just what you can share about what happened to you and why you ended up here working under a name that's apparently your real name, even though the military declared you dead. Nathan considered how much he could reveal without compromising operational security, and he decided that the broad strokes were probably safe as long as he avoided specifics about locations and objectives. I was a fighter pilot assigned to a squadron that conducted missions requiring absolute discretion. During one of those missions, my wingman's aircraft experienced mechanical failure over hostile territory, and I stayed with him instead of following orders to abort. We both survived the immediate crisis, but my aircraft took damage during the extraction, and I had to eject at an altitude that was too low for safe parachute deployment. The impact shattered my spine badly enough that I'll never fly again. He paused and looked at Lily. While I was recovering, my wife Claire died in a car accident, and I was left with a daughter who needed stability more than she needed a father who was still trying to process trauma from a career that had ended violently. I changed my name legally from Nathan Cross to Nathan Cross. Actually, I never changed it. The military just declared me dead under my service name, and I started using my legal name for civilian employment. I took the job at Ashford Aerospace because it paid enough to cover rent and food and Lily's medical expenses, and because working around aircraft was the closest I could get to the life I'd lost. Victoria listened with the focus she normally reserved for technical briefings, and Nathan could see her piecing together the narrative into a coherent picture that explained everything from his technical knowledge to his reluctance to draw attention to himself. The fire today, when you ran in to save Kyle, were you thinking about the men you served with? Nathan nodded slowly. I was thinking about the 4 Marines who died during the same mission where I saved my wingman. I was thinking about the fact that I survived when they didn't, and that surviving means something only if you use that survival to prevent other people from dying when you could have saved them. The conversation might have continued, except that Lily stirred and opened her eyes, and her disoriented gaze found Nathan before finding Victoria. Confusion crossed her fevered features because Victoria Ashford was the last person she'd expected to see in her hospital room, and Nathan squeezed her hand gently to reassure her. Miss Ashford came to check on you, kiddo. She's making sure you get the best care possible. Lily's eyes moved between Nathan and Victoria, and despite the fever, her mind was sharp enough to recognize that something had changed in the dynamic between her father and the woman who'd humiliated them both in the hangar less than a week ago. She managed a small smile that was more polite than warm. Thank you for coming, Miss Ashford. Victoria returned the smile with unexpected gentleness. You're welcome, Lily. And please call me Victoria. I think we're past the point of formal titles. She stood and told Nathan that she needed to return to the facility to deal with the aftermath of the demonstration failure, and that he should take whatever time he needed before returning to work. She paused at the door and looked back at him. We'll continue this conversation later. There are things we need to discuss about your role at the company and about how we move forward from today's events. But for now, focus on your daughter. That's what matters most. After Victoria left, Nathan sat with Lillian, helped her sip water from a cup with a straw, and she asked him what had happened at the demonstration because Mrs. Chen had told her there had been an emergency but hadn't provided details. Nathan explained about the fire and about rescuing Kyle, and Lily's eyes widened when she understood that her father had run into danger instead of away from it. Were you scared? Nathan considered lying to protect her from the truth, but Claire had taught him that children deserved honesty even when honesty was uncomfortable. I was terrified. But being scared doesn't mean you don't act. It just means you recognize the danger while you're acting anyway. Lily processed this with the seriousness she brought to everything that mattered, and then she asked the question that Nathan had been dreading. Did people see your tattoo? Nathan nodded, and Lily's expression shifted to concern because she understood better than most 8-year-olds that her father's past was something he'd been trying to keep hidden. What's going to happen now? Nathan wished he had a better answer than the one he could provide. I don't know, kiddo, but whatever happens, we'll face it together. That's what we've always done, and that's what we'll keep doing. Lily seemed satisfied with this response, and she closed her eyes and drifted back into sleep, while Nathan sat beside her and thought about the fact that Victoria now knew who he was and what he'd done, and that knowledge meant the careful invisibility he'd maintained for 6 months was irretrievably shattered. The question now was what Victoria would do with that knowledge, and whether the answer would make Nathan's life better or worse than it had been when he'd been just another custodian whose expertise was noticed only when it prevented disasters. The night passed slowly, with nurses checking on Lily every 2 hours, and Nathan dozing fitfully in the chair that was designed more for sitting than sleeping. By morning, Lily's fever had dropped to 101 degrees, which Dr. Okonkwo said was progress, but not enough to justify discharge. They'd need to keep her for at least another 24 hours to ensure the downward trend continued and that no complications emerged. Nathan called Mrs. Chen to let her know what was happening, and she insisted on bringing him clean clothes and food because she knew he wouldn't leave Lily's side long enough to take care of himself. She arrived at noon with a care package that included a change of clothes for Nathan, a stuffed animal for Lily, and enough homemade soup to feed them both for several days. Her kindness made Nathan's throat tight with gratitude because Mrs. Chen had no obligation to care for them, but did so anyway because that's who she was. While Mrs. Chen sat with Lily, Nathan stepped into the hallway to check his phone and found several text messages from Walter Hayes asking about Lily's condition and whether Nathan needed anything. He also found a message from Victoria's assistant saying that Victoria wanted to meet with him on Thursday morning to discuss his employment status and future role at the company, and that the meeting would take place in her office at 9 a.m. The message created anxiety that Nathan tried to suppress because speculation about what Victoria intended was pointless when he'd find out soon enough. He returned to Lily's room and spent the afternoon reading to her from a book about aviation pioneers that Mrs. Chen had brought from their apartment, and Lily listened with focused attention despite the lingering effects of her illness. By evening, Lily's fever had dropped to 99.8 degrees, and Dr. Okonkwo said that if the trend continued overnight, they could discuss discharge in the morning. Nathan felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders because the prospect of taking Lily home meant she was improving, and improvement meant the crisis was passing into memory rather than continuing as present reality. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep and the hospital had quieted to the low hum of machines and distant footsteps, Nathan sat in the darkness and thought about everything that had happened since Monday morning, when he'd arrived at work expecting another routine day of cleaning and invisibility. The demonstration failure, the fire, the tattoo exposure, Victoria's appearance at the hospital, the health coverage that would save him from bankruptcy, all of it felt like events from someone else's life rather than his own. He thought about Robert Ashford and about the fact that the man who'd spent years searching for Nathan had built a company where Nathan had been working without either of them knowing it. The coincidence felt like something that had meaning beyond mere chance, though Nathan had never been superstitious enough to believe that the universe arranged events to serve narrative purposes. But coincidence or not, the result was that Nathan's carefully constructed anonymity had been destroyed, and he'd need to decide whether that destruction was liberation or disaster. Wednesday morning brought Lily's discharge papers and Dr. Okonkwo's instructions for home care that included rest, hydration, and monitoring for any recurrence of fever or other symptoms. Nathan thanked her and the nurses who'd cared for Lily, and then he drove home through Seattle traffic while Lily dozed in the passenger seat. Mrs. Chen was waiting at their apartment with the door unlocked and the heat turned up, and she'd stocked their refrigerator with enough food to last a week. Nathan tried to thank her adequately, but words felt insufficient for the depth of gratitude he felt. So he settled for a hug that Mrs. Chen returned with the warmth of someone who'd adopted him and Lily as honorary family. Thursday morning arrived too quickly, and Nathan woke with the knowledge that he'd need to face Victoria's questions about his future role at the company. He got Lily settled with Mrs. Chen and drove to Ashford Aerospace with the kind of resignation that came from knowing that some conversations couldn't be avoided regardless of how much you might want to postpone them. Victoria's office occupied the entire 40th floor, and her assistant directed Nathan to wait in a conference room while Victoria finished a phone call with the Pentagon about rescheduling the demonstration. When Victoria finally appeared, she was carrying a folder that Nathan recognized as his employment file, and her expression was difficult to read. She sat across from him and opened the folder, and Nathan saw documents that included his original application, his background check results, and what appeared to be research that someone had conducted about his military service. I had my legal team pull everything they could find about your service record without requesting classified documents. What they found was a lot of gaps and redactions, but enough to confirm that you were exactly who you said you were and that your discharge was honorable despite the circumstances that ended your flying career. Victoria closed the folder and met his eyes. I'm offering you a position as Chief Safety Advisor with a salary commensurate with your experience and expertise. You'll oversee all safety protocols for testing and demonstration, and you'll have authority to halt any operation that you determine presents unacceptable risk. The position reports directly to me, and it comes with full executive benefits, including the health coverage I've already authorized for Lily. Nathan had expected questions, not job offers, and the surprise must have shown on his face because Victoria smiled slightly. You saved my father's life. You've prevented 2 catastrophic failures in the past week, and you risked your own safety to save one of our engineers. I'd be a fool not to recognize that those actions demonstrate exactly the kind of judgment and courage that this company needs in someone responsible for safety oversight. The offer was generous to the point of being overwhelming, and Nathan struggled to formulate a response that acknowledged both the opportunity and the complications it created. I appreciate the offer, but I need to be clear about my limitations. My back injury means I can't work the kind of hours that executive positions typically require, and I need flexibility to take care of Lily when situations like this week's medical emergency arise. Victoria nodded understanding. The position allows for flexible scheduling, and we can arrange for backup coverage when you need to attend to family matters. What I need from you is your expertise and your willingness to tell me when we're making mistakes that could cost lives or destroy the company. Everything else is negotiable. Nathan felt the weight of 6 years of invisibility and diminished expectations lifting slightly, and he realized that Victoria was offering him more than just a job. She was offering him the opportunity to use his knowledge and experience in ways that mattered, and to do so without having to hide who he was or what he'd done. He accepted the position, and Victoria's smile suggested genuine pleasure at his decision. They spent the next hour discussing logistics and responsibilities, and by the time Nathan left her office, he'd agreed to start in the new role the following Monday after Lily had fully recovered from her illness. As he drove home, Nathan thought about calling Walter to share the news and about how he'd explained to Lily that her father was no longer a custodian, but was instead someone whose opinion was valued enough to warrant an office and a salary that would mean they could move to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. The changes felt surreal and slightly frightening because change always was, but beneath the fear was something that felt like hope. Monday morning arrived with autumn rain that turned Seattle's streets into rivers, reflecting the city's steel and glass towers. And Nathan Cross walked through the entrance of Ashford Aerospace Technologies, wearing a suit that he'd purchased over the weekend with money from his first paycheck advance. The suit was off the rack from a discount store, rather than custom tailored, like the ones worn by the executives whose offices occupied the 40th floor. But it was clean and professional, and marked him as someone whose role had fundamentally changed even if his identity remained the same. The security guard at the entrance nodded recognition when Nathan swiped his new badge, which was printed with a photo that had been taken Friday afternoon and which identified him as Chief Safety Advisor rather than custodial staff. The change in title felt surreal enough that Nathan half expected someone to stop him and explain that there'd been a mistake, that custodians didn't become executives regardless of what they'd done or who they'd saved. But no one stopped him as he made his way to the elevator that would take him to the executive floor. His office was located 3 doors down from Victoria's and had a window that overlooked Puget Sound, where container ships moved through morning fog like ghosts navigating between worlds. The office was small compared to those occupied by VPs and board members, but it was larger than the apartment Nathan had lived in for the past 2 years, and it contained a desk and a computer and bookshelves that were currently empty because Nathan owned few books and hadn't yet decided what should occupy the space that was meant to convey expertise and authority. Victoria had arranged for his office to be ready before his first day, and she'd left a note on the desk that welcomed him to his new position and reminded him that they had a meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. to discuss the timeline for rescheduling the Talon 9 demonstration. Nathan set down the messenger bag that contained Lily's latest drawings and the technical manuals he'd been studying over the weekend, and he stood at the window for several minutes while he tried to reconcile the person he'd been last Friday with the person he was being asked to become. The transition wasn't just about job titles or salary increases, though both of those things mattered in practical terms that would affect where Lily went to school and whether Nathan could afford the physical therapy his back needed. The transition was about visibility and the end of the protective anonymity that had allowed him to exist without explaining why someone with his qualifications was working far beneath his capabilities. Now he'd need to answer questions about his background and his experience, and some of those answers would require revealing things he'd spent 6 years trying to keep hidden. At 9:30, Walter Hayes appeared in Nathan's doorway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested satisfaction at seeing Nathan in an environment that better matched his abilities. Walter had been instrumental in convincing Victoria that Nathan deserved the promotion, and he'd spent hours over the weekend helping Nathan prepare for the kinds of questions that board members would inevitably ask about his qualifications and his authority to override engineering decisions. They sat in Nathan's office while Walter explained the political landscape that Nathan would need to navigate, and the explanation included detailed information about Richard Thornton's opposition to Victoria's leadership and his likely reaction to learning that a former custodian had been promoted to a position that gave him veto power over projects that Thornton considered his domain. Walter's assessment was that Thornton would view Nathan's promotion as evidence of Victoria's poor judgment, and that he'd use the promotion as ammunition in his ongoing campaign to convince the board that Victoria lacked the experience necessary to lead the company. The warning was delivered with the calm pragmatism of someone who'd survived decades of corporate politics and understood that competence alone wasn't sufficient to protect you from people who were determined to see you fail. Walter advised Nathan to document everything, to never make a decision without explaining his reasoning in writing, and to remember that people like Thornton were skilled at twisting good faith disagreements into evidence of incompetence or insubordination. Nathan absorbed this advice with the same attention he'd once given to briefings about hostile air defenses, and he recognized that his new role would require a different kind of situational awareness than he'd needed as a custodian. Invisibility had protected him from scrutiny, but visibility would expose him to attacks that were more subtle but potentially more damaging than the physical dangers he'd faced during his military service. At 10 a.m., Nathan attended his first meeting in Victoria's office, and the discussion focused on the engineering team's analysis of what had caused Friday's catastrophic failure during the demonstration. The preliminary investigation had determined that the fire had been caused by a rupture in the auxiliary fuel line that hadn't been identified during pre-flight inspections, and that the rupture had occurred at a weld point that showed evidence of microscopic fractures that had propagated under stress until the line failed completely. Dr. Helen Kim presented the findings with the methodical precision that Nathan had come to expect from her, and her conclusion was that the weld had been performed incorrectly during the manufacturing process, and that similar welds throughout the fuel system would need to be inspected and potentially replaced before the demonstration could be rescheduled. The work would take at least 3 weeks, which meant postponing the Pentagon demonstration until mid-December at the earliest. Victoria accepted this timeline with visible frustration, but without the anger that Nathan had witnessed during previous setbacks, and he wondered whether Friday's events had changed her approach to leadership or whether she was simply too exhausted to maintain the aggressive posture that had defined her first 6 months as CEO. When Dr. Kim finished her presentation, Victoria turned to Nathan and asked for his assessment of the inspection and repair plan. Nathan had spent the weekend reviewing the Talon 9's technical specifications and the manufacturing documentation for the fuel system, and his analysis aligned with Dr. Kim's conclusions, but included an additional recommendation that the inspection should extend beyond the fuel lines to include all pressure-bearing components that had been welded during assembly. The recommendation was conservative and would add another week to the timeline, but Nathan's experience had taught him that catastrophic failures were usually caused by multiple small problems, rather than single large ones, and that addressing only the obvious issue often meant missing the underlying systemic problem. Victoria approved the expanded inspection without hesitation, and her willingness to accept a timeline that would delay the demonstration even further suggested that she'd learned from Friday's disaster that rushing to meet arbitrary deadlines was more dangerous than taking the time necessary to ensure safety. The meeting concluded with assignments being distributed to the engineering team, and Nathan returned to his office with the knowledge that he'd just made his first decision in a role that carried real authority and real consequences. The rest of Monday passed in a series of meetings and introductions that were designed to integrate Nathan into the executive structure and to establish his credibility with people who'd known him only as a custodian. Some of the introductions went smoothly because the people involved had witnessed Nathan's technical expertise or his actions during Friday's fire, but others were uncomfortable because Nathan could see the skepticism in faces that had learned to judge people based on their credentials and their connections, rather than their demonstrated abilities. Richard Thornton was conspicuously absent from all the meetings Nathan attended, which Walter later explained was because Thornton was in Washington, D.C., meeting with Pentagon officials to discuss the demonstration failure and to position himself as the person who could restore confidence in Ashford Aerospace's ability to deliver on its commitments. The absence created a temporary reprieve from the confrontation that Nathan knew was inevitable, but it also meant that Thornton was building a narrative about the company's problems that didn't include context about Nathan's role in preventing even worse outcomes. Tuesday brought Nathan's first interaction with the board members who'd been on the tour when Victoria had used him as a prop for her mockery of people who worked with their hands rather than their minds. The board meeting was scheduled to review the investigation findings and to discuss the financial implications of postponing the Pentagon demonstration, and Nathan had been asked to present the safety assessment that justified the expanded inspection timeline. He arrived at the boardroom 15 minutes early to set up his presentation materials, and he was reviewing his notes when Richard Thornton entered and saw Nathan standing at the head of the conference table. Thornton's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like contempt, and his voice carried the patronizing tone that people used when they wanted to establish dominance through casual cruelty. "I see we're letting the help use the good china now. Tell me, Mr. Cross, does your new title come with training in how to present to people who actually understand what they're looking at, or are we supposed to just nod politely while you explain things you learned from mopping floors?" Nathan had expected hostility, but not quite this level of open disdain, and he felt the familiar tension that came from being attacked by someone who held power over your livelihood. But he'd survived worse attacks than verbal contempt, and Walter's advice about documentation and reasoned responses echoed in his mind as he formulated his reply. "My presentation will focus on the technical analysis of the fuel system failure and the rationale for expanding the inspection scope beyond the immediate failure point. If you have specific concerns about my qualifications to assess these issues, I'd be happy to discuss my background after the meeting. The response was professional and non-confrontational, which seemed to disappoint Thornton because he'd clearly been hoping for defensiveness or anger that could be used as evidence of Nathan's unsuitability for his new role. Before Thornton could continue the attack, Victoria entered with several other board members, and the meeting began with Victoria providing an overview of the investigation findings. Nathan's presentation came next, and he walked through the analysis with the same methodical precision he'd learned from giving mission briefings, where lives depended on everyone understanding exactly what the plan was and what could go wrong. He explained the weld failure mechanism, the evidence of microscopic fractures that had propagated under stress, and the statistical likelihood that similar defects existed in other welds throughout the fuel system. His recommendation for expanded inspection was supported by data and by analogies to similar failures that had occurred in other aerospace programs, and he concluded by noting that the additional 3 weeks required for comprehensive inspection was preferable to experiencing another catastrophic failure during the rescheduled demonstration. The presentation was well received by most of the board members who asked technical questions that Nathan answered with the confidence that came from actually understanding the systems he was discussing. But Thornton interrupted twice to suggest that Nathan was being overly conservative and that his lack of experience in the aerospace industry was causing him to overestimate risks that more seasoned professionals would recognize as acceptable. The second interruption crossed the line from skepticism into something that felt personal, and Nathan saw Victoria's jaw tighten in the way that suggested her patience with Thornton's behavior was approaching its limit. She cut off Thornton mid-sentence with a tone that left no room for argument. Richard Mr. Cross's assessment is based on both theoretical analysis and practical experience that exceeds what most people in this room possess, myself included. If you have technical objections to his methodology, I'd be interested in hearing them. But questioning his qualifications or his judgment without providing substantive counter-arguments isn't productive and isn't appropriate, given that he's been hired specifically to provide the kind of independent safety oversight that prevents disasters like Friday's fire. The rebuke was delivered in front of the entire board, and Thornton's face flushed with anger that he tried to mask as professional disagreement. He offered no technical counter-arguments because he clearly didn't have any, and the meeting continued with the board ultimately approving the expanded inspection timeline and the associated budget increase. After the meeting, Walter pulled Nathan aside and explained that Victoria's public defense of Nathan would make Thornton even more determined to find ways to undermine both of them, and that Nathan should expect increased scrutiny of every decision he made going forward. The warning was delivered without dramatics, just a straightforward assessment of the political reality that Nathan now occupied, and Nathan acknowledged it with the same acceptance he'd learned to apply to any situation that involved being targeted by people who wanted him to fail. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of technical meetings and inspection reports, and the gradual discovery that working as an executive required different skills than working as a custodian, but was equally exhausting in its own way. Nathan spent his days reviewing engineering analyses and his evenings helping Lily with homework that was becoming increasingly sophisticated as her teachers recognized that she needed challenges beyond what the standard curriculum provided. Lily had recovered fully from her meningitis, and Dr. Okonkwo had cleared her to return to school with no restrictions on her activities. The medical bills that Nathan had been dreading arrived and were covered entirely by the executive health plan that Victoria had authorized, which meant Nathan could redirect the money he'd been saving for medical expenses toward moving to a better apartment in a neighborhood where Lily could walk to school without Nathan worrying about her safety. The new apartment was in Fremont, a neighborhood that was more expensive than Beacon Hill, but which had better schools and lower crime rates, and windows that looked out onto trees rather than alleyways. Nathan signed the lease on a Saturday morning and spent the weekend moving their possessions with help from Walter and Mrs. Chen, who'd insisted on coming along despite being 73 years old and having no business carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs. Mrs. Chen cried when they said goodbye, not because she was sad, but because she was happy that Nathan and Lily were moving up in the world, and she made Nathan promise to bring Lily to visit at least once a month because she'd grown attached to the little girl who drew airplanes and asked questions that made adults think harder than they wanted to. Nathan promised, and he meant it, because Mrs. Chen had been family when he'd had no one else, and that kind of loyalty deserved to be honored. On the third Monday of Nathan's tenure as Chief Safety Advisor, Richard Thornton called an emergency board meeting without consulting Victoria, which Walter explained was a violation of corporate bylaws, but which Thornton was apparently willing to risk because he decided that the time had come to make his move against Victoria's leadership. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. and the agenda item was listed simply as Leadership Review and Succession Planning, which was corporate euphemism for attempting to remove Victoria as CEO. Victoria learned about the meeting from her assistant 30 minutes before it was scheduled to begin, and she immediately called Nathan and Walter to her office to discuss strategy. Her face was pale with anger, and her hands were shaking slightly as she explained that Thornton had spent the past 2 weeks building support among board members who were concerned about the company's financial performance and the delayed Pentagon demonstration. Walter's assessment was that Thornton had probably secured enough votes to force a leadership review, but not enough to actually remove Victoria, which meant the meeting would be a test of whether Victoria could defend her decisions persuasively enough to maintain the board's confidence. Nathan's role would be to provide technical support if questions arose about safety protocols or inspection timelines, and to be prepared to explain why his recommendations had been necessary rather than excessive. The board meeting began at 2 p.m. in the conference room, where Nathan had given his first presentation 3 weeks earlier, and the atmosphere was tense enough that Nathan could feel it pressing against his chest like physical weight. Thornton opened the meeting by expressing concern about the company's direction under Victoria's leadership, and he spent 15 minutes outlining a case that Ashford Aerospace had suffered multiple setbacks during Victoria's tenure, and that these setbacks suggested a pattern of poor judgment and inadequate oversight. The case was constructed carefully to avoid direct criticism that could be easily refuted, instead relying on implications and suggestions that the board members were left to interpret on their own. Thornton mentioned the demonstration failure without acknowledging that Nathan had identified two critical problems before they could cause even worse disasters. He mentioned the delayed timeline without explaining that the delay was necessary to prevent catastrophic failures during the rescheduled demonstration. And he mentioned Nathan's promotion as an example of Victoria making hiring decisions based on personal feelings rather than professional qualifications. Victoria responded with a defense that was both passionate and technically precise, explaining that every decision she'd made had been based on sound reasoning and expert advice, and that the setbacks the company had experienced were the result of manufacturing defects that had existed before she'd become CEO rather than problems created by her leadership. She pointed out that Nathan had saved the company from disasters that would have resulted in loss of life and loss of contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that promoting him had been one of the best decisions she'd made since taking over from her father. The exchange continued for nearly an hour, with different board members asking questions and expressing concerns, and Nathan watched the dynamics shift as Victoria's defense gained traction with people who'd been uncertain about whether to support Thornton's motion. But the turning point came when Walter Hayes stood and asked to be recognized, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd earned the right to be heard through decades of service to the company. "I've worked at this company for 43 years, and I knew Robert Ashford better than anyone in this room, except possibly his daughter. Robert built this company on principles that valued competence and courage over credentials and connections, and he believed that the best leaders were the ones who surrounded themselves with people who were willing to tell them hard truths rather than comfortable lies." Walter paused and looked directly at Thornton. 3 weeks ago, Richard sent me an email asking me to support his motion to review Victoria's leadership. In that email, he mentioned that he'd been aware of the weld defect in the Talon 9's fuel system for approximately 72 hours before Nathan Cross identified it during his custodial duties. Richard chose not to raise the concern with the engineering team because he believed, and I'm quoting from his email here, that allowing the demonstration to proceed with a known defect would create an opportunity to demonstrate Victoria's inability to manage complex technical programs. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute, and Nathan watched Thornton's face turn from red to white as he realized that Walter had just accused him of deliberately sabotaging the demonstration in order to damage Victoria's reputation. Several board members began speaking at once, and the meeting dissolved into chaos that took Victoria several minutes to restore to order. Thornton denied Walter's accusation and demanded to see the email that supposedly contained his admission, and Walter produced his phone and displayed the message for the entire board to review. The email was damning in its clarity, and it demonstrated that Thornton had prioritized his personal ambition over the safety of the company's employees and the success of the demonstration. The board voted unanimously to terminate Thornton's employment, effective immediately, and security was called to escort him from the building, while he protested that he'd been taken out of context and that Walter was misrepresenting his intentions. Nathan watched the scene with the detached fascination of someone observing a disaster from a safe distance, and he thought about how different the outcome might have been if Walter hadn't had the foresight to document Thornton's confession. After Thornton had been escorted out, the board meeting continued with a discussion of succession planning that focused on strengthening Victoria's executive team rather than replacing her. The conversation was collaborative rather than adversarial, and by the time the meeting ended at 6 p.m., Victoria had secured commitments for additional resources and support that would help stabilize the company during the transition period following Thornton's departure. Nathan returned to his office feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the emotional toll of watching people destroy themselves through their own choices. He thought about calling Lily to let her know he'd be home late, but before he could pick up his phone, Victoria appeared in his doorway with an expression that mixed relief with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you for being willing to stand up there and defend your decisions. I know presenting to the board isn't comfortable for you, and I appreciate that you did it anyway." Nathan accepted the thanks with a slight nod, and Victoria continued, "I'm scheduling a press conference for Friday to announce some changes in the company's leadership structure and to introduce our new approach to safety oversight. I'd like you to be there so we can publicly acknowledge the role you've played in preventing disasters and in building a safety culture that prioritizes people over timelines." The request made Nathan uncomfortable because press conferences meant visibility that would extend beyond Ashford Aerospace to the broader aerospace community and potentially to people who might recognize his name or his face from his military service. But refusing Victoria's request after everything she'd done for him and Lily felt like cowardice. And Nathan had spent enough of his life running from visibility to recognize that continued hiding served no purpose except to limit his ability to use his expertise to prevent harm. He agreed to participate in the press conference, and Victoria's smile suggested genuine pleasure at his willingness to step further into the light. They spent the next 30 minutes discussing what the press conference would cover and what Nathan would be expected to say, and by the time Nathan left the office at 7 p.m., he'd committed to speaking publicly about his transition from custodian to executive, and about the importance of creating workplace cultures where expertise was valued regardless of where it came from. Friday's press conference was held in the main conference room at Ashford Aerospace with approximately 50 journalists and industry analysts in attendance. Victoria stood at the podium and delivered prepared remarks about the company's commitment to safety and transparency, and she announced Nathan's appointment as Chief Safety Advisor with authority to halt any operation that presented unacceptable risk to personnel or equipment. When it was Nathan's turn to speak, he approached the podium with the same controlled nervousness he'd felt before his first combat mission, and he delivered remarks that had been prepared with Victoria's communications director, but which felt authentic because they reflected his actual beliefs about how organizations should operate. He talked about the importance of creating environments where people felt empowered to raise concerns without fear of retaliation, and about the fact that catastrophic failures were usually prevented by people paying attention to small problems before they became large ones. The journalist asked questions about Nathan's background and his qualifications and how someone who'd been working as a custodian had ended up in an executive role, and Nathan answered honestly about his aerospace engineering degree and his military service and the circumstances that had led to him working in roles that were beneath his capabilities. He didn't provide details about classified operations or about the specific mission that had ended his flying career, but he was open enough about the broad strokes that the journalist could construct a narrative that was accurate even if it wasn't complete. One journalist asked whether Nathan's promotion represented a publicity stunt designed to distract from the demonstration failure, and Victoria's response was sharp enough to cut. "Mr. Cross prevented 2 catastrophic failures before they could occur, and he risked his life to save one of our engineers during the fire that resulted from a manufacturing defect we're still investigating. If recognizing that kind of judgment encourages a publicity stunt, Then I hope more companies start engaging in similar stunts because the aerospace industry would be safer for it. The press conference concluded with Victoria announcing the establishment of the Ashford Foundation, a nonprofit organization that would provide aerospace education and scholarships to students from underserved communities who showed aptitude and interest in careers that required technical expertise. The foundation would be funded by 5% of the company's annual profits, and it would be overseen by a board that included Victoria, Nathan, and Walter, along with several education specialists who understood the barriers that prevented talented students from accessing opportunities that could change their lives. The foundation was named in honor of Robert Ashford, and Victoria's voice broke slightly when she explained that her father had believed the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to reach for it, and that the foundation would work to make that belief a reality for students who'd been told that careers in aerospace were beyond their capabilities. Nathan stood beside Victoria during the announcement, and he thought about Lily and about all the drawings she'd created of aircraft she dreamed of designing someday, and he felt something that might have been hope for a future where his daughter's talents would be recognized and nurtured, rather than dismissed or ignored because she came from a family that had been struggling to survive rather than thriving. 1 year later, on a Saturday morning in October, when Seattle's autumn light turned the city's waters into molten gold, Nathan stood beside Victoria and Lily on a platform that had been constructed outside the newly completed Ashford Foundation Learning Center. The building occupied 2 acres adjacent to the main Ashford Aerospace campus, and it contained classrooms and laboratories and flight simulators and workshop spaces where students could learn by building rather than just by reading. 50 students from Seattle's public schools had been selected for the foundation's inaugural cohort based on aptitude tests and teacher recommendations and essays that explained why they wanted to pursue careers in aerospace. The students ranged in age from 10 to 18, and they came from neighborhoods where college seemed impossible and where the sky was something that existed above them rather than something they could actually touch. Lily was among the youngest students in the cohort, not because Nathan had pulled strings, but because her application had demonstrated the kind of sophisticated understanding of aerospace engineering that the selection committee had found remarkable. She stood on the platform wearing her best dress and holding the oversized scissors that would be used to cut the ribbon that officially opened the Learning Center. Victoria gave a speech about her father's legacy and about the importance of creating opportunities for students who'd been told that their dreams were impractical or impossible. She talked about Nathan and about how recognizing his expertise despite his job title had taught her that the best leaders were the ones who valued competence over credentials and who created environments where people felt empowered to share their knowledge without fear of being dismissed or ridiculed. When Victoria finished speaking, she invited Nathan to say a few words, and he approached the microphone with the same nervousness he always felt when speaking to large groups. He looked out at the students who'd gathered for the ribbon cutting, and he saw faces that reflected the same hunger for knowledge and opportunity that he'd seen in Lily since she was old enough to hold a pencil. Someone asked me once whether anyone can learn to fly, and my answer is the same now as it was then. Anyone can learn to fly if they're willing to fall first. Not because falling is necessary for flight, but because being willing to fall means you're brave enough to try something that might not work. This building exists because people were willing to try things that might not work, and because they kept trying even when the world told them to stay on the ground where they belonged. He paused and looked at Lily. My daughter taught me that losing your wings doesn't mean losing your sky. It just means learning different ways to fly, and sometimes the most important flight is the one that lifts other people up rather than lifting yourself. This foundation is about teaching students that the sky belongs to everyone willing to work for it, and that the only limits that matter are the ones you accept instead of the ones you challenge. The ribbon was cut, and the students poured into the Learning Center with the excitement of people discovering spaces that had been designed specifically for them. Nathan watched them explore the flight simulators in the wind tunnels and the workshops where they'd build model aircraft and learn the principles that governed how machines conquered gravity, and he felt a peace that had eluded him since the day his spine had shattered against the Nevada cliff face. Victoria stood beside him, and her voice was quiet when she spoke. My father would have been proud of this. He spent his life building machines that touched the sky, but I think this might be a better legacy than any aircraft he ever designed. Nathan nodded agreement, and they stood together watching the students, while above them the sky stretched infinite and blue and full of possibilities that hadn't existed a year ago when Nathan had been mopping floors and trying to remain invisible. He'd lost his wings, but he'd found something that mattered more, and the weight of that knowledge felt like the closest thing to redemption that someone with his history could hope to achieve. Lily appeared at his side and slipped her hand into his, and her smile was bright enough to rival the October sun. One of the instructors had explained to her how the flight simulator worked, and she'd immediately understood the control systems well enough to suggest improvements that the instructor had said were actually quite clever. Nathan squeezed her hand and told her he was proud of her, and she leaned against him with the easy affection of someone who'd always known she was loved. The afternoon passed with demonstrations and tours and conversations with parents who were struggling to understand how their children had been selected for opportunities that seemed too good to be real. Nathan spent hours answering questions and explaining that the foundation's commitment was long-term and that students who completed the program would have access to scholarships and internships and mentorship that would support them through college and into careers that could sustain families and build futures. By evening, the crowd had thinned, and Nathan found himself standing alone in one of the workshops looking at the tools and equipment that students would use to transform theoretical knowledge into physical reality. Walter appeared beside him, and they stood together in comfortable silence before Walter spoke. Robert would have wanted you to know that this foundation exists because you were willing to stop hiding. You could have kept mopping floors and collecting your paycheck and protecting Lily through invisibility, but instead you chose to use your expertise, even when using it meant exposing yourself to scrutiny you'd been avoiding for years. That choice didn't just save lives during the demonstration. It created this place where hundreds of students will learn that their dreams aren't impossible. Nathan absorbed these words with the kind of gratitude that was too large for language, and he thought about the trajectory that had brought him from a Nevada cliff face to a learning center in Seattle, and about how the path between those 2 points had been marked by losses and failures, and choices that had felt like surrenders at the time, but which had somehow led to something that felt like purpose. He thought about Claire and about the promise he'd made to let Lily fly, and he understood finally that keeping that promise hadn't required him to regain his own wings, but had instead required him to build places where other people's wings could develop and strengthen and eventually carry them towards skies they'd been told were beyond their reach. The steel wings tattooed on his forearm had once marked him as someone who belonged to an elite squadron that officially didn't exist, but now they marked him as someone who'd learned that the greatest flight wasn't the one that carried you highest, but the one that showed others how to rise. Through hardships to the stars, the motto still held true, but the hardships had been different than he'd expected, and the stars were being reached by people he'd taught rather than by himself. Nathan left the learning center as the sun was setting and drove home to the apartment in Fremont, where Lily was probably already working on drawings of the aircraft she'd seen in the flight simulator. He thought about calling Mrs. Chen to share the news about the successful opening and about having dinner with Victoria and Walter to celebrate what they'd built together from the wreckage of catastrophes that could have destroyed everything. But mostly he thought about the fact that for the first time in 6 years, he felt like someone who was flying rather than falling, and that the difference between the two wasn't about altitude or velocity, but about purpose and the knowledge that the distance you descended could be measured by the heights to which you'd helped others climb. The wings he'd lost had been replaced by something better, and the sky he'd thought was closed to him had opened in ways he'd never imagined possible. Above the city, stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue, and Nathan Cross drove toward home with the certainty that sometimes the hardest journeys led to destinations worth reaching, and that falling didn't mean failing as long as you used the impact to build foundations strong enough to support the dreams of everyone who came after.